Chapter 24:14. The war broke out. The dire beasts continuously invaded that world and fought with the demons and humans that originally existed in that world. In the process of this battle, some dire beasts entered the groups of creatures that were of the same nature as the dire beasts in this world and began to subdue these groups of creatures. They stimulated their dire beast nature and made these groups of creatures become the power of the dire beasts, helping them to fight and kill. Although the humans and demons in this world were not weak, they were only humans and demons in the same world after all. Even if there were humans and demons who came from the outside world to carry out missions, there were only a few of them. On the other hand, their enemies, the dire beasts, had many people in despair and a large number of false saints. As for the number of dire beasts, there was an endless stream of them. No matter how many they lost, they could be replenished. Under such circumstances, the outcome of the war could be imagined. In the end, in just a few years, the humans and demons in this world were completely defeated and wiped out by the dire beast. The entire world was completely occupied by the dire beast. "Who the hell are you?" At the last moment before they were killed, both the humans and the demons let out such a cry. "We are the dire beasts." A false saint of the dire beasts finally voiced out his voice for the first time. He voiced out his voice to the two races that were destined to become the dire beasts' enemies and were destined to fight with the dire beasts in the various worlds to compete for the position of the rulers of the various worlds. Dire beasts? Why are the dire beasts so powerful? Haven't we already defeated all the dire beasts? This thought appeared in the hearts of the humans and demons at this moment. In the end, through some mysterious channel, it was transmitted to the headquarters of both parties. In the public space of both parties, it was known to the other humans and demons. However, the outcome of this development could only be known in the future. For now, the dire beasts had already achieved victory. They had already conquered the first foreign world. In Duan Shi's eyes, the providence of the dire beasts had already collided with the other two enormous providence because of this action. It was suppressing the two enormous providence, and also withstanding the pressure of the two providence. The clash of luck has begun. Next, I'll need to find a balance and form a tripartite balance to stabilize the situation inside this giant tower. Duan Shi thought to himself as he looked at the three powerful auras. The eyes on his 9 heads became unprecedentedly deep. He could sense that there was a gaze following the connection of providence and probing this place. He was extremely familiar with this gaze. It was the gaze of the demon ancestor. Obviously, the demon ancestor had also sensed the abnormality of fate and had a premonition of war. Feeling this gaze, even though Duan Shi had already made up his mind, he could not help but smile bitterly to himself. Back then, he watched helplessly as the demon ancestor turned from a human hero to the demon ancestor and became the enemy of humans. Now, he had fallen into the same fate. He had also become the enemy of the human race and had to fight against the human race. Furthermore, he had to fight against the demon race that he had helped previously. This feeling of the Wheel of Fortune had naturally made him feel rather complicated. Amidst the complicated feelings, Duan Shi let out a sigh. The all-devouring lion head opened its mouth and lunged at the world in front of it. Compared to the many spacetimes attached to him, that world was naturally many times larger. However, compared to the lion head, it was not even enough for him to swallow it in one gulp. Therefore, at this moment, this world had already fallen into his mouth without causing any ripples. With a gulp, it was swallowed into his stomach and entered that strange spacetime. They haven't come out yet. The dire beasts who sensed all of this roared in shock and anger. At this moment, there were still countless dire beasts in that world. There were even a few false sages among the dire beasts. Under such circumstances, if that world was devoured by the 9-headed lion, wouldn't that mean that the dire beasts had also been devoured? Even though they did not have deep feelings for other dire beasts, Since they had already acknowledged that they were from the same race and had a strong sense of identity with the entire race, it was naturally impossible for them not to have any psychological fluctuations. At this moment, those in despair even began to suspect if all of this was a conspiracy of the nine-headed lion. Did the nine-headed lion encourage them to conquer that world in order to devour it in the end? However, it was so powerful and huge. Why would it need to obtain the consent of the living beings in that world to devour it? Couldn't it just devour it directly? Why did it need them to take the unnecessary step of conquering that world? All kinds of complicated thoughts appeared in the hearts of those in despair at this moment. And at this moment, all the space-time began to squirm. It was as if some kind of power was grabbing these space-time and twisting it. It was also as if some strange existence was injected into these space-time through some mysterious channel, causing some subtle changes to the foundation of these space-time. This change made many of the people in despair feel that something was amiss. One by one, they stopped the urge to vent their emotions that they could no longer suppress. Instead, they began to carefully observe what changes had happened to the spacetime they were in and why there were such changes. As they observed, they discovered a rather embarrassing fact. That was, these spacetime had begun to expand. Some added a continent, some added islands, or simply opened up a new area on the continent that did not exist before, and in these continents, these islands, and these areas, they could see some rather familiar figures. They were the wild beasts that they had sent into another world. That world was divided into different spacetimes? Seeing all this and recognizing those familiar figures, how could these people in despair not understand what had happened? After understanding this, they naturally knew that they had misunderstood the nine-headed lion. It devoured that world. Perhaps it was just a way for it to integrate that world into the myriad heavens and realms. When they thought of this, they suddenly felt that perhaps this was the best way to conquer these worlds. Moreover, this kind of conquest was also the most thorough and beneficial way for the myriad heavens and realms. After all, although they were unwilling to admit it, they all knew that the many spacetimes in the myriad heavens and realms were still a level lower than the real world. Not only the size, but also the degree of perfection and tightness of the rules and laws. In comparison, they were much worse. It was precisely because of this that the spacetimes in the myriad heavens and realms could only be called spacetimes and not worlds. Even if they called the whole of these spacetimes as the myriad heavens and realms, this essence could not be changed. In this way, by devouring other worlds and integrating them into every spacetime in the myriad heavens and realms, it was equivalent to making up for the shortcomings of the myriad heavens and realms little by little. One day, when there were enough worlds integrated into the myriad heavens and realms, the countless spacetimes in the myriad heavens and realms would truly grow into countless worlds. At that time, the name of the myriad heavens and realms would truly be worthy of its name. Of course, there were so many spacetimes in the myriad heavens and realms. After devouring a world, the compensation for each spacetime would naturally not be too much. Under such circumstances, if he wanted to nurture every spacetime into a real world, the number of worlds needed would probably reach an unimaginable level. Perhaps the government would need billions of worlds to achieve this goal. However, it was still a way. And when these wild beasts discovered this, they suddenly had more motivation to conquer other worlds. We must make the myriad heavens and realms worthy of its name. At this moment, these people in despair made up their minds and a strong fighting spirit surged from their bodies. Originally, they had taken action to conquer the world and save the wild beasts based on the nine-headed lion's request. But now, in addition to these reasons, they had another reason to devour the world and make up for the myriad heavens and realms. Moreover, in comparison, the second reason was obviously more tempting to them. After all, even if they were already in despair, they could not transcend these spacetimes and could not travel freely in the boundless darkness like the nine-headed lion. Instead, They needed to stay in those spacetimes and rely on the existence of spacetimes to resist all threats from the outside world. In this way, the more perfect, vast, and powerful the spacetime they were in, it meant that they would be safer. With such a background, it was only natural that they would have such motivation. As the people in despair understood this, many living beings under the despair, from top to bottom, began to understand this change one after another. Following that, countless wild beasts in the myriad heavens and realms began to have a stronger fighting spirit. They began to rub their fists and look forward to the next time they found a world. The war to conquer the world had begun. Duan-Shur naturally would not disappoint this kind of expectation. After transforming that world into nutrients for the growth of many spacetimes, he once again turned around and rushed towards another world in another direction. Then, the process of conquest like before happened again. Another few years later, that new world was conquered. The demon race and humans in it either fled or were obliterated, and finally disappeared without a trace. That world was no longer able to resist, and was devoured by Duan-Shur's lion head. Not long after, it was transformed into nutrients for the growth of many spacetimes in the myriad heavens and realms, allowing those spacetimes to grow again. Compared to the last time, the wild beasts were much calmer when the nine-headed lion devoured the world this time. Although they were still a little surprised, at least it was not as exaggerated as the last time. When those spacetimes really got nutrients and really grew, the wild beasts in them also returned to this spacetime. All the wild beasts finally completely relaxed and began to cheer to their heart's content. Why did the wild beasts unite? Without a core of wisdom, they would never be able to form a whole. Who was it that became their core? Could it be a mutant? In the public space of the demon race, the monster ancestor sensed that the fate of the entire demon race was getting more and more oppressive. There were already 2 mission worlds discovered by the demon race that had been conquered or even destroyed. At this point, no matter how unwilling he was to believe it, he could only admit that the wild beasts had already united like the demon race and had begun to become enemies with the humans and demons at the same time. This had obviously disrupted his original plan, causing many of his original arrangements to turn into floating clouds. At this moment, a false sage of the demon race came forward to request for battle. Ancestral Master, we can't remain silent anymore. Now, the clansmen below are already showing signs of anxiety. If we still can't defeat the wild beasts, I'm afraid there will be quite a bit of chaos. To the demon race, the wild beasts were their greatest enemies. That was because this world was shared by the wild beasts, the demon race, and humans. When they occupied this world, they chased the wild beasts out at the end, allowing them to wander into the endless darkness of the outside world. Now that the wild beasts had suddenly appeared, the demon race began to worry that they would take revenge on the demon race and counterattack in an attempt to take back this world. This worry naturally caused the many demons, who were originally extremely at ease, to fall into slight fear. And this slight fear was what the false sage of the demon race had said, anxiety. Hearing this, the demon ancestor's eyes flashed and he said, "All right, the intentions of the wild beasts are unclear now. Bring a few elites to test it out first." When the false sage of the demon race heard that, he was overjoyed and hurriedly replied, "Yes, Ancestral Master." The demon ancestor waved his hand and asked him to make arrangements. After the false sage left, the demon ancestor looked at the pressure that belonged to the wild beasts in the darkness from afar and frowned slightly. This pressure seems a little familiar. When did I feel this pressure before? This thought flashed through his mind. Duan-Shur had already transformed into a 9-headed lion and lived for billions of years in the boundless baleful aura and karma. In the public space of the demon race, a considerable amount of time had passed. In such a long time, the demon ancestor had unknowingly raised his cultivation realm once again. Right now, he was no longer at the level of a false sage. Instead, He had reached the peak of the Despair Realm and had vaguely touched the edge of the Supreme Emperor Realm. Compared to back then, his strength was more than 10,000 times stronger. With this kind of strength, it had been hundreds of millions of years since he had felt this kind of pressure when he was still weak. Chapter 24:15. So this is how the will of heaven and earth controls heaven and earth. In an extremely mysterious place, Luo Fan slowly opened his eyes. His gaze was filled with emotions. The changes in the giant tower could be said to be the result of his control. It could also be said to be the changes caused by the Tao of heaven and earth operating on its own. This was because be it humans, monsters, or wild beasts, be it Duanshi, the ancestral martial beast, or the other cultivators, he only added a thought that represented a certain kind of luck to them. Although, when he attached his will to it, he was inclined to hope that this fate would eventually develop into a state of sustainable development, so that he wouldn't have to waste too much energy to maintain the stability of this world. However, he only added a slight inclination. As for how things would develop, as for the positions of those living beings who had been endowed with enough providence, their encounters, their awareness, their thoughts, and even their actions, everything was the result of the natural evolution of this world. Because of this, the many changes in heaven and earth, or in other words, the changes in the giant tower were the result of his control, as well as the changes caused by the Tao of heaven and earth operating on its own. Looking at Duanshi, the demon ancestor, the desolate beasts, the demon race, and the humans, all developing almost according to the most perfect situation he had expected, and finally forming the most ideal state, Luo Fan's shock could be imagined. In order to achieve this result, he only added an inclination to them. At that moment, his understanding of heaven and earth, as well as the will of heaven and earth, had been greatly improved. Many things that were initially blurry suddenly became so clear. In fact, many things that he originally thought would take billions of trillions of years to accomplish had become simple things that he could accomplish with a single thought. One of the most obvious difficulties was to completely control heaven and earth. Previously, he thought that if he wanted to completely control heaven and earth, he would need to use the heaven and earth light to completely activate all the light shadows in the residence of the will of heaven and earth, then refine them. With the number of light shadows, it would probably take him billions of trillion years to achieve his ultimate goal. However, now that he understood the magical use of luck, he already knew that what he used before was the stupidest method. In fact, from the perspective of luck, if he wanted to activate the countless lights and shadows and completely refine them, even under the slowest circumstances, it wouldn't take more than 100 years. After understanding this, Luo Fan's heart moved. The heaven and earth light that had originally completely integrated into the countless light shadows around him began to separate and condense above his head. It turned into a mirror-like, living thing, but it was completely indescribable in terms of color. As the heaven and earth light separated from the light shadows began to disappear. The originally rather bright residents of the will of heaven and earth began to gradually fall into a state of darkness. In just a few short breaths, the residents of the will of heaven and earth had brazenly turned into what it looked like when Luo Fan first appeared, into a dim state where even Luo Fan could only see the blurry outlines of the light shadows. At this moment, all the living beings in this world felt an inexplicable emptiness emerging from the depths of their hearts, whether it was in the giant tower or outside the tower. In fact, the luck of many living beings began to faintly tremble, causing all kinds of distracting thoughts that they could not have in the past to involuntarily surface in their hearts. Amidst these distracting thoughts, the goal that they had fought for their entire lives seemed to have lost its sacred halo in the blink of an eye. Even with the influence of spiritual inertia, they actually faintly felt that their previous thoughts were not worth it. If this state continued for a long enough time, the entire world would inevitably fall into a state of chaos that was even more severe than the one that had descended into the tribulation. However, it was obvious that Luo Fan wanted to see a stable world, So how could he sit back and watch this state continue? At this moment, he let out a soft cry, and an incomparably powerful thought brazenly poured into the heaven and earth light above. As his thought poured in, the heaven and earth light began to undergo unimaginable changes according to his thought. Amidst these changes, all kinds of incomparably mysterious fluctuations began to be produced from the heaven and earth light above his head, rushing out in all directions. Under these fluctuations, the originally extremely dim light shadows in the surroundings seemed to have been instantly activated, and their brightness began to increase rapidly. The speed at which they increased was even faster than the speed at which they had dimmed. In the end, when the fluctuations swept past, the brightness of these lights had already increased to more than 10 times the original brightness before it dimmed. As the fluctuations continued to spread, more and more light shadows were lit up in the surroundings. Among the many light shadows, there were also a large number of light shadows that had not appeared before. They quickly brightened and caught up with the light shadows that were originally lit up. In the end, they were on par with the light shadows that were previously lit up, and finally connected with the original light shadows, causing the residents of the heaven and earth will to become brighter and brighter. Along with this change, the emptiness deep in the hearts of all living beings in this world was instantly filled up. Immediately after, their original disagreement with their own goals and pursuits was overturned. Their souls returned to their original state, and not only did they completely recover their original goals, but they also became even more determined than before. Inside the giant pagoda, both Duanshur and the martial ancestor beast were experiencing similar changes. However, compared to what other living beings thought was an illusion, they were clearly aware of the changes in their bodies and minds due to their high realms and strong control over their minds. Even though their minds had recovered, their emotions did not completely return to the state before the changes. Instead, their expressions became inexplicably ugly. What exactly is controlling my mind? The same thought appeared in the minds of Duanshur and the demon ancestor at the same time. As this thought appeared, they suddenly felt that the goals that they had been pursuing seemed to have become dull. The demon race, the wild beasts, the tripartite confrontation, the main characters of the world, the giant tower, the ominous aura, the karma, and everything else seemed to have become insignificant. Although they had a sense of responsibility and dedication, everything was based on their own will. If all these decisions, even if they had to sacrifice themselves, were truly out of their own will, they would not hesitate even if they had to pay a huge price to do so. However, if all these decisions were not out of their own will, but were controlled and influenced by some existence behind them, then even if such decisions could bring them great benefits, they would still reject it. A seed of doubt unknowingly appeared in the hearts of the two of them. This seed would gradually germinate with the passage of time and the development of things, and finally blossom and bear fruit. Luo Fan was not aware of all this at the moment. Of course, even if he had noticed it, he would not have cared. After all, to him, this world was merely a test born from his sixth great tribulation. In the end, he would still have to transcend this world and reunite his fragments in this world with the countless fragments in the other worlds. Under such circumstances, no matter what the process was, he would eventually become the enemy of this world. In other words, even if he did everything perfectly and tried his best to eliminate the soil from which the seeds of doubt appeared, the seeds would definitely appear at some point in the future. Even if it did not appear in the form of the seeds of doubt, it would definitely appear in other forms. In this case, the emergence of the seeds was only a little earlier than expected. Since he was confident that he could completely control this world and replace the world's will, the existence of the seeds of doubt no longer had much effect on him. In the residence of the world's will, the mysterious fluctuation released by the light of heaven and earth had already swept across an area that was at least 10,000 times wider than the light and shadows that he had activated before. the light and shadows that he had activated and controlled emitted a light that made the area that was originally only bright in the center as bright as day. Through the light and shadows that were emitted by the light and shadows, he could even see the vague silhouettes of light and shadows in the surroundings. At the same time, Luo Fan had a feeling that he had become a part of this world. In other words, he felt that a certain area of this world had become his body. Moreover, this part of his body continued to expand as the fluctuation continued to spread, constantly replacing the boundless world in the outside world, making a larger and larger area a part of his body. This feeling was so mysterious and wonderful that it made him feel that his spirit was undergoing an indescribable sublimation. He could vaguely sense that he was gradually able to understand the thinking of the worlds will contained within the light of heaven and earth. This situation seemed wonderful, but there was an unimaginable danger in it. This was because this situation meant that he was being assimilated by the world. In other words, if he couldn't break away from this wonderful feeling, he would completely lose his consciousness as a living being in the end and completely become the world's will of this world. At that time, the current Luo Fan would be equivalent to dying, and his soul would scatter. Once things developed to that stage, at least in this world, Luo Fan's sixth Great Tribulation would already be considered a failure. Fortunately, Luo Fan had already condensed the light of heaven and earth that completely belonged to him before he entered this Great Tribulation. Due to the existence of the light of heaven and earth, even if his countless fragments were separated by the Great Tribulation and thrown into the countless worlds, they could still be closely connected through the light of heaven and earth. This close connection made each fragment in a certain world seem independent, but in fact they were completely controlled by Luo Fan as a whole. In this way, the real Luo Fan, or in other words, Luo Fan as a whole, would naturally be able to discover the danger that his fragments in this world were facing. At this moment, the light of heaven and earth trembled slightly, and a subtle force acted on the fragment's will. This caused Luo Fan, who was originally immersed in his own sublimation and constantly approaching the level of the world's will, to feel his body and mind turn cold, and his mind instantly awakened. I was almost done for. After waking up, Luo Fan broke out in a cold sweat, and there was an indescribable lingering fear in his eyes. He only needed to think about the situation just now to know how dangerous it was. Although he was now a strong person who had entered the tribulation and was many times stronger than other cultivators below the Supreme Emperor level, he was still far from being able to compare to a true divine. Under such circumstances, the level of the world's will was obviously still a forbidden zone that he could not approach. Given his control, if he really approached that level, his mind would definitely be destroyed in an instant. His sense of self would definitely be erased in an instant. When that time came, his body might still exist, and his strength might even increase tremendously, but he would no longer be himself. He would become a completely unfamiliar existence, and he would become the world's will of this world. When that time came, his thoughts and actions would be completely in line with the position of the world's will, and his actions would completely remove all traces of him. That would obviously not be Luo Fan. As he recalled this danger, Luo Fan was extremely glad that he had already condensed the complete light of heaven and earth. However, since he already knew where the danger was, it was no longer a problem for him to do what he needed to do. At this moment, he quickly withdrew his consciousness and allowed the consciousness of the light of heaven and earth to take over control of the world, allowing the world's will within the light of heaven and earth to bear the sublimation of the will brought about by the increase in the scope of its control. For Luo Fan, this sublimation was a fatal change, and if he really accepted it, his sense of self would be erased. However, for the world's will within the light of heaven and earth, this sublimation was only a strengthening of the world's will. Chapter 24:17. As a creature's consciousness, although the light of heaven and earth could control almost everything in this world, it could not suppress the instinctive rejection of the organs that had become foreign. It was precisely because of this that even though Luo Fan had borrowed the light of the world to control the entire world, he was still unable to stop the rejection of the world towards the world he was currently in. If this continued, this small world would eventually collapse under the pressure of the heavens and the earth, and he, the ruler of this small world, would naturally have to face the instinctive pressure of this world. At that time, even the most optimistic estimate would affect his control over this world. Because of this, Luo Fan could only sigh at this time. His heart slightly moved and a mysterious brilliance was released from his body. These lights were one after another, divine ability after another. God abilities that contained the mysteries of concepts. After the lights rushed out of his body, they quickly seeped into the depths of the world. They melted into the laws of the world, into time and space, and into the endless energy and matter. As these God abilities fused into the world, the entire world quickly stabilized. It was as if an extremely stable existence had suddenly connected all the regions of the world and stabilized the world. At this moment, the many huge chains that had appeared at the boundary of this small world seemed to have encountered an incomparably firm obstruction. They could no longer be pulled back, and the many cracks that had appeared because of these chains had also stopped spreading. It was as if some kind of power had suddenly stopped their time, preventing them from evolving any further. The entire world in the outside world gradually began to tremble. The trembling reached the depths of the world, into the depths of all living beings and matter in the world. That's because the trembling had reached such a deep level that no living being could sense it. After all, even their senses were trembling along with it. It was precisely because of this that at this moment all living beings felt an indescribable pressure in their hearts. However, they did not know what kind of ruthless method the world was using at this moment. It was just like how a living creature felt towards a foreign object in one's body. If one could expel the foreign object from one's body, one's vitality would at most be greatly injured. However, if he couldn't expel this foreign object, then what awaited him might be the collapse of the various circulatory systems in his body, and at this time, to this world, this small world was such a strange thing. Therefore, it was extremely important for this world to destroy or expel this small world. It was even related to the life and death of this world. Instincts are so powerful that I can't suppress them even though I've completely mastered them. At this moment, Luo Fan had an inexplicable look of admiration on his face. At that moment, he was using the light of the world to suppress the rejection of the small world, doing his best to suppress the terrifying pressure it was exerting on the small world. Unfortunately, all of his efforts were only able to produce a small effect. At most, he could only slightly slow down the rate of effect. In Luo Fan's eyes, at this time, the whole world was already in turmoil. Almost all of its potential had been activated. Even the way in the dark had started to undergo all sorts of changes that had never appeared before. The entire way seemed to have suddenly woken up from a dream, and it started to tremble and squirm from the depths. All sorts of mysterious and wonderful power continuously radiated from it. Through various communication channels that Luo Fan could not understand even with his control over the world with the help of the light of the world, the power was transmitted to normal spacetime. It was transmitted to the surroundings of the small world that Luo Fan was in, and it poured into the mysterious chains, greatly strengthening the chain's power and increasing the pressure that the small world had to endure. This seemed unbelievable, but it was actually very normal. Currently, the light of the world had already become the world's will, which was equivalent to becoming a certain living being's consciousness. Obviously, although a living being's consciousness could control other living beings with great agility, it could not control the various subconscious and instincts hidden beneath the living being's consciousness. Here, naturally, the light of the world could not have any effect on the rejection of the small world. At this moment, the giant tower in the center suddenly started to shake violently. This shaking was different from the shaking of the entire world in the outside world. It was even more intense than the shaking of the world in the outside world. It was precisely this lack of synchronization that caused the shaking of the giant tower to be extremely conspicuous at this moment. Almost every living being in this world could feel the shaking of the giant tower. Amidst the shaking, surging black fog spewed out of the giant tower. It continuously gathered in the void and piled up, gradually forming an incomparably huge dark cloud. This mass of dark clouds kept surging, and loud rumbling sounds came from within the dark clouds. This sound was extremely shocking. Any living being that heard it felt as if their roots were being shaken, and their minds became blank. The entire world was shaking even more intensely at this moment. Furthermore, countless space-time cracks were continuously appearing and disappearing in the dark cloud. The limit has been broken? With the help of the light of the world, Luo Fan's expression became slightly solemn. At this moment, in the eyes of ordinary cultivators, the giant tower was just a dark cloud. However, in his eyes, he could clearly see that the dark cloud contained an almost endless number of worlds. Among them, there was even a giant 9-headed lion that was soaring in the dark cloud while carrying a huge world. Obviously, these were extensions of the giant tower. Everything that existed in them should have only existed in the giant tower. At this moment, the 9-headed lion suddenly trembled and suddenly cried out in disbelief. "This is outside the giant tower?" It was because he had already deduced an unbelievable fact from the changes in the surrounding environment. He had actually been sent out of the giant tower and appeared in the outside world. This situation had already completely exceeded his expectations, causing him to be unable to react for a moment. All of a sudden, his 9 lion heads shook, and the perspective in his eyes changed rapidly. As his perspective changed, the light of providence quickly appeared in his eyes. How could this be? How could the providence collapse? Could it be that the dire beast's providence has run out? No. It's not just the dire beast. The providence of the demon clan and humans has also collapsed. Is this the end of the entire world? The moment he saw the providence clearly, his mind became extremely chaotic, and the faces on the 9 lion heads became extremely strange. At this moment, an extremely dazzling light spot appeared in the dark cloud. At first, this light spot was extremely small, even dimmer than a firefly. However, ever since it appeared, it began to brighten at an unimaginable speed. Not long after, it had already become a small star. After a while, it turned into a bright moon. After a while, it turned into a giant sun. The endless light and heat that it emitted almost dispersed the dark cloud. It was a world that was at least 10 times vaster than any world above the 9-headed lion. There were countless strange lines on that world. These lines extended out of that world and spread across the entire dark cloud, connecting the countless worlds within the dark cloud. Even some of the worlds that the 9-headed lion was attached to were connected by the lines, forming a strange connection with the sun-like world. The demon clan's public space. It seems that the demon ancestor has also sensed that something is wrong. Seeing this, the 9-headed lion, who was also known as Duan Shi, thought to himself. At this moment, an astonishing aura was released from the sun-like world and began to sweep across the entire dark cloud. It swept through all the worlds and even seeped into them, allowing all living beings to clearly sense the existence of this terrifying aura. "It's really you, Alliance Master Duan Shi." At this moment, the demon ancestor's voice rang in Duan Shi's ears. Duan Shi looked over and saw the demon ancestor's figure appearing on the surface of the sun-like world. It looked like a giant human-shaped bulge had appeared on the surface of the sun-like world. Seeing this, Duan Shi sighed and said, "Alliance Master? I'm not even a human anymore. Just like you, I've become the ancestral ancestor of other clans. However, there's no need to talk about these things. You should feel it now, right? We've truly regained our freedom." Duan Shi changed the topic and said to the demon ancestor. However, he had recovered from the shock just now, and he had already figured out what the collapse of luck represented. The collapse of destiny meant that he was no longer under the control of destiny. He no longer needed to act according to destiny. He could truly do whatever he wanted to do according to his own will. This was obviously true freedom. Hearing this, the demon ancestor was stunned at first, then a strange expression appeared on his face. He seemed to have come to a sudden realization, a little excited, and a vague sense of loss. He murmured, as expected, "No wonder I suddenly feel a lot more clear-headed. So I've truly regained my freedom. Am I unconscious?" At this moment, in the small world, Luo Fan could not help but let out a sigh. At this moment, he had already sensed through the light of heaven and earth that all the light figures in the residence of the will of heaven and earth had been covered by a layer of strange mist. Through the mist, he could still see the many changes of the light figure, but it was already separated by a layer. It felt like he was looking at the flowers in the mist, or the moon in the water. It seemed a little illusory, not to mention controlling it as he pleased. He couldn't even change it even a little. The changes happened when the giant tower changed, and the ominous aura and karma force gushed out from the giant tower. Although he was displeased by the changes, he could understand why. In fact, if the will of heaven and earth were compared to a living being, the current situation was like the living being had already fainted. Fainting was the body's instinctive choice. It was a choice that appeared when the living being wanted to focus all its power to fight against something harmful to its body. The situation that the light of heaven and earth encountered was similar. As the will of heaven and earth, the light of heaven and earth had also lost control of the will of heaven and earth because it wanted to focus all its power to expel the foreign object. In other words, because the threat of the small world was too great, the will of heaven and earth had no choice but to faint to fight against the small world. Without the suppression of the will of heaven and earth naturally dominated the will of heaven and earth. Influenced by this instinct, almost all the living beings naturally knew that they needed to destroy something in the will of heaven and earth in order to have a future. The feeling was so strong that even the demon ancestor and Duan Shi could not resist it. At this moment they were driven by this sudden mentality, and each of them shifted their gazes from each other to the small world that was sealed by countless strange chains. "This is Master's place of seclusion?" Duan Shi's expression changed the moment he discovered the location of the small world. The moment he thought of this, the urge to destroy the small world in his heart skyrocketed. He could not even control his body. He roared and quickly pounced toward the small world. During this process, the countless dark clouds around him, which were the endless baleful aura and karmic karma that had rushed out from the giant tower, began to churn and expand towards the small world along with him. By the time the nine-headed lion arrived in front of the small world and was about to collide with it, the ominous clouds had already expanded in front of the small world and were about to devour it. "No. This is not my will. Who is controlling my mind?" All of a sudden, Duan Shi's 9 lion heads raised their heads and roared at the sky. As he roared, countless rays of light were emitted from his body, and there were strands of profound concepts within the light. Clearly, he had unleashed all the profound uses of the concepts he had comprehended in an attempt to resist this sudden method of controlling his mind. At this moment, he wished he could swallow back his words that he had already obtained true freedom. Chapter 24:18. Duan Shi and the demon ancestor were completely different from ordinary cultivators in terms of status and identity. Because of this, they could barely maintain a trace of clarity under the instinct of heaven and earth. They knew that their souls were being influenced by some incredible existence. However, this did not seem to be a good thing for them. That was because this did not bring them joy, nor did it bring them excitement. Instead, it brought them pain. The feeling of watching one's own body and soul betray oneself was unbearable for an ordinary person. Not to mention the fact that Duan Shi and the demon ancestor were already sect masters. At every moment, the two of them wished they could commit suicide so that their fates would not be in someone else's hands. Fortunately, their minds were extremely firm, and their never-giving-up style had long been engraved in the depths of their hearts. Therefore, even though their hearts were in so much pain, they still did not put the urge to commit suicide into reality. "What the hell is this? Why does heaven and earth want to go against Master?" Duan Shi shouted from the bottom of his heart, but the 9-headed lion did not tremble in the slightest. It opened its 9 mouths and shot out 9 beams of light towards the small world that was entangled by countless chains. Not only did these beams of light contain Duan Shi's comprehension of cultivation and concepts, but they also contained a grand momentum. It was as if the entire heaven and earth had added a huge amount of power to these beams of light to destroy its target. At this moment, Luo Fan felt a shocking impact colliding with the small world. Under the impact, the small world trembled slightly. The cracks that had been frozen suddenly began to expand in all directions again. This change caused his expression to change. The control of the heaven and earth light on heaven and earth has been disrupted. This thought flashed through his mind. With this thought, he did not dare to be negligent. The countless rays of light that shot out of his body shook slightly, and the mysteries of the concepts they contained instantly skyrocketed. As the profundity of his concept skyrocketed, the many rays of light that were originally supporting the small world and freezing it suddenly strengthened a little. As it strengthened, the cracks that were about to break the stagnant effect of the rays of light once again became stagnant. After resolving the crisis of the small world, his heart moved slightly, and he sensed that the heaven and earth light that was located at the residence of the heaven and earth will suddenly condensed. In an instant, he felt that the absolute control that the heaven and earth light had over the entire heaven and earth will had been covered by endless information. The information was extremely messy and chaotic. At this moment, it seemed to have appeared out of thin air and completely covered the heaven and earth will within the heaven and earth will. Although the heaven and earth will was not damaged, its connection with the outside world had been greatly weakened now. He was still able to connect with Luofan, and was still able to receive Luofan's control. This was because the light of heaven and earth was condensed by him, and it could be said that it had already fused with his soul. What a powerful instinct! It seems that the world's will wasn't completely destroyed. Instead, it collapsed and merged with this instinct. With a thought, this guess appeared in his mind once again. As he made this guess, a faint sneer suddenly appeared on his face. "However, do you think it'll be so easy to get rid of me?" As he sneered, the heaven and earth light started to change violently. The light on it started to flash wildly, and the heaven and earth will within the heaven and earth light started to undergo various indescribable changes. As these changes occurred, a tremendous impact started to appear from the heaven and earth light. It swept in all directions and caused an extremely shocking impact on the fog that covered the residence of the heaven and earth will. As this impact occurred, the fog that had originally covered the countless lights and shadows became thinner and thinner. The dim lights and shadows that were originally hidden in the fog also started to brighten up. Everything within the light and shadows became clearer and clearer. The information that had drowned out the heaven and earth will within the heaven and earth light started to be isolated bit by bit. Although it continued to surge into the heaven and earth light and cover the heaven and earth will inside, its influence on the heaven and earth will was rapidly weakening. As these changes occurred, Luo Fan felt that his control over the heaven and earth will was slowly recovering. At this moment, the demon ancestor, whose mind was being controlled, had already led the demon race army along with the boundless ominous aura and karma to the surroundings of the small world that was sealed by the chains. They surrounded the small world and began to unleash their power in a frenzy as they smashed towards the small world. Compared to Duanshi, who had turned into a 9-headed lion, the individual attacks released by the demon race were naturally much weaker. In fact, they could not even be compared to each other. However, there were just too many of them. Their numbers were so great that it almost exceeded the limits of what could be described with numbers. On top of that, the cooperation between the demon race was extremely great. They vaguely formed an extremely mysterious formation, causing all the powers to combine in an almost perfect manner. They complemented each other and boosted each other's strength. In the end, the effects of their attacks were not much weaker than the nine-headed lions. This kind of attack directly landed on the small world. Just like the attack from the nine-headed lion, it was not obstructed by the chains that wrapped around the small world at all. It directly passed through the chains that were like a ball of thread and smashed into the small world, causing it to tremble once again. This is too much. Luo Fan could not help but feel helpless when he sensed this change. Countless living beings had to cooperate with each other. If it was based on the number of living beings, every increase in the number of living beings required at least a few times more training time. Now that there were billions of demon race individuals cooperating with each other, it would probably take tens of thousands of years to achieve the same level of tacit understanding. If they wanted to achieve this level of perfect cooperation, not to mention tens of thousands of years, tens of millions of years, or even hundreds of millions of years might not be able to achieve it. But now? Where had these demon race trained before? They had actually achieved such perfect cooperation on their first time working together. This kind of situation had already torn common sense into countless pieces. To be able to do such a thing so openly, the heaven and earth had simply given them a cheat that was simply insane. However, this was already something that he had already expected. Now, his behavior had already begun to break free from the shackles of this world and had begun to do his best to transcend this world. In this way, it was only natural for him to bear the backlash of this world. The heaven and earth had only given these living beings a cheat, so this was actually a relatively peaceful response. At this moment, Luo Fan let out a soft shout. The brilliance that was released from his body contained the mysteries of the concept that was once again enhanced. In an instant, it once again suppressed the tremors caused by the numerous attacks of the demon race. At this moment, one mission world after another continuously emerged from the black fog. They were also gathering towards the small world that was sealed by the chains. These mission worlds were different from those in the huge tower. Each of them emitted a light that was far more dazzling than when they had been in the huge tower. This kind of light was so bright and dazzling that it looked like countless stars in the pitch-black night sky. Among the countless stars, there was a star that was growing bigger and brighter at an extremely fast speed. In just a few breaths' time, the star had already grown to the size of a bright moon and quietly hung in the sky outside the small world, standing side by side with the demon progenitor and Duanxer. Public space. This was the first thought that came to the demon progenitor and Duanxer when they saw the bright moon-like star. Both of them were humans, so the public space that they were referring to was naturally the first public space that had appeared in the huge tower. In other words, it was the public space of humans. At this moment, the towering statue in the public space began to undergo a strange change. From the appearance of a statue, it gradually turned into a body of flesh and blood and became real. Not long after, the statue had turned into a colossus, an incomparably powerful golden-armored god of war. After the golden-armored war god appeared, he instantly rushed out of the public space and placed the public space behind his head. He raised his hand and clenched his fist before he directly punched the small world that was bound by the chains. This punch was almost condensed with the purest power that even time and space could not interfere with. In the face of this power, even the small world was instantly blasted into a huge fist mark that occupied half the sky. Boundless, terrifying energy leaked out of the huge fist seal and poured into the small world. It frantically attacked the space-time of the small world, the laws, and even the existence of the small world itself. Found it. At this moment, Luo Fan did not try to stabilize the small world like before. Instead, he let out a soft cry. As he let out a soft cry, he suddenly raised his hand and grabbed at the air. As he grabbed at the air, the light of heaven and earth in the residence of the will of heaven and earth had already extended into a thin ray of light and directly rushed into a light shadow below that had already been partially dispelled of smoke. At this moment, the entire world was suddenly engulfed by endless brilliance. It was as if endless rays of light were falling from the sky like raindrops, causing the entire world to be filled with a brilliance that was the same as the light of heaven and earth. A brilliance that could not be described with words. As the endless rays of light appeared, the entire world began to tremble violently. The endless murderous aura and karma that originally covered the sky were instantly penetrated and dispersed, causing the black fog within to become thinner and fainter. At a glance, the entire world seemed to have become much clearer. Along with this change, the countless mission worlds that were originally hidden in the endless murderous aura and karma began to fall as if they were being pulled by an endless force. Some of the mission worlds even cracked and collapsed during this process. As for the demon ancestor, Duanshi, and the huge golden-armored war god that held up the public space, their eyes showed signs of struggle. It was as if some kind of power was cleansing their souls and trying their best to break free from the invisible existence's control over their souls. At this moment, the huge tower in the middle of the world produced a powerful suction force and began to frantically absorb the endless murderous aura and karma that had been released from its body. The murderous aura and karma condensed into a huge tornado that was sucked into the huge tower. As the black fog was sucked into the huge tower, countless mission worlds that were relatively close to the huge tower were also sucked in. From afar, it looked as if countless stars were being directly swept up and devoured by the huge tower. Boom, 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 boom. At this moment, every part of the world began to rumble. Amidst the rumbling, boundless power erupted in an instant. All the laws in the world trembled violently in that instant. An oppressive feeling, as if a storm was about to descend, appeared in the hearts of the living beings who had just broken free from the instincts of the world and gained a sliver of clarity. A huge long river directly appeared in the void. This long river was so huge that just its width alone seemed to be billions of light-years long. Such a long river traversed the world and completely covered the sky of the entire world. It replaced the endless murderous aura and karma that had previously gushed out from the huge tower. This is the Great Tao. All the living beings with a clear mind knew what this long river was the moment they saw it. At this moment, the long river gradually turned from an indescribable color to a dark red color. The entire world was illuminated by the dark red light emitted by the long river. It looked as if the original normal spacetime had turned into a land of slaughter. The rain-like light that descended from the sky and shrouded the entire world gradually disappeared at this moment. As for the living beings that had been cleansed by the light, they once again lost all their clarity. Even existences like Duanshi and the demon ancestor were no different from the other living beings at this moment. They had completely lost the last of their clarity, and their eyes emitted a dark red light. They looked like the incarnations of the Great Tao. At this moment, Luo Fan slightly frowned. In this situation, it was obvious that the instincts of this world had directly taken action. Chapter 24:19. As the small world shrank, the countless chains that were originally tightly wrapped around the small world also began to shrink crazily. It looked like a huge mountain range was smashing towards Luo Fan. These countless chains were originally condensed by the instincts of this part of the world. They were born to oppress Luo Fan into constructing such a small world. Naturally, they were constantly shrinking. It was very normal for them to behave like this. Luo Fan's expression did not change in the slightest in the face of the countless chains that were like mountains. Raising his hand and pointing towards the void, a ray of light that contained an extremely dense and profound concept shot out from his hand. In the blink of an eye, it had already arrived around the chains. As he slightly trembled, all the chains collapsed and turned into powder that was devoured by the void. In the blink of an eye, they disappeared without a trace. At this moment, the concept ability condensed slightly and arrived in front of Luo Fan. It condensed into a dim light again. It looked not much brighter than the light emitted by a firefly. At this moment, the dark red river of the great path in the void began to surge. A kind of absolute malice directly appeared on the halo around Luo Fan's body at this moment, causing the halo to creak. It felt as if some kind of invisible force was crushing the halo with all its might, causing it to quickly collapse and disappear. This was the most direct hostility of heaven and earth, as well as the most direct hostility of the great Tao. At this moment, Luo Fan already felt that he was completely incompatible with this world. Everything in this world, whether it was something that he had refined or something that he was completely unfamiliar with, now treated him as an irreconcilable enemy, as expected of the instinct of the world's will. It is indeed powerful. Sensing the malice that had condensed into a substance, this thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. At this moment, the corresponding existences in the various planes also felt this kind of malice that was emitted by all the existences in this world. However, compared to the reality plane, the malice in the other planes behaved differently. Some were extremely orderly, while others were extremely chaotic. However, it was not as balanced as the reality plane. Clearly, the main body of this malice was in the reality plane. The malice emitted by the existences in other planes that corresponded to heaven and earth was merely the malice attached to this plane of reality. When he realized this, Luo Fan instantly felt much more at ease. After all, to him, although his ability to control the corresponding existences in the other planes was not as good as his body in the reality plane, he could already control them almost perfectly. Under such circumstances, if the malice of a plane was chaotic to a certain extent, the corresponding existences in that plane could easily resist it. In this way, it was clear that no matter how strong the malice was, even if the effects of the attack had reached an unimaginable level, he still had a way out. In other words, no matter how the situation in the reality plane developed due to the malice, his life would be guaranteed. With this kind of guarantee, how could he not feel much more at ease? However, although his life was guaranteed, Luo Fan could not just watch as the malice destroyed him. After all, what he wanted this time was to transcend this world. He wanted to let his fragments in this world return to their whole body. With such a goal, how could he just stand there and wait for the world and the great Tao to take action? At this moment, in the residence of the world's will, the light of the world had already pulled back the traces of light that had been sent into a certain light shadow. Compared to when it entered the light shadow, the traces of light were slightly dimmer. It seemed to have suffered some unknown damage. After the light returned to the light of the world, it completely fused with the light of the world with a slight ripple. It became one with the light of the world again, and the dimness was naturally eliminated. Clearly, the damage it had suffered had been completely recovered in an instant. Then, the world's light trembled again. As it trembled, the residents of the worlds will began to violently tremble. The originally extremely stable space began to distort violently, as if some kind of strange paper had begun to distort under the influence of an external force. At the same time, the many light shadows that had been slightly lifted also began to distort indescribably. As the distortions occurred, some light shadows randomly pieced together, some directly shattered, turning into even more fragments, and some intertwined with other light shadows, as if they were weaving a strange hemp rope. Due to the strange changes of these lights and shadows, the laws of this world underwent countless complicated and strange changes. Every place seemed to be undergoing some kind of strange transformation. The ground suddenly turned upside down, birds suddenly swam underground, earthworms flew in the air, trees grew upside down, their roots grew on the ground, and branches and leaves extended into the ground. All sorts of scenes that overturned the understanding of living beings filled the entire world in an instant. If it was normal, there would definitely be living beings who would find it absurd and unbelievable. But at this moment, not a single living being in this world paid any attention to these changes. Or perhaps it could be said that even their wills and knowledge had been distorted by this abnormality. Not a single one of them felt that this was abnormal, and not a single one of them felt that this was absurd. A huge vortex gradually appeared above the long river of the great path. Compared to living beings, this vortex was naturally huge. Even the 9-headed lion that Duan Shi had transformed into seemed insignificant compared to this vortex. However, this was only relative to living beings. Compared to the long river of the great Tao that traversed the heavens and the earth and almost completely covered the entire sky, this whirlpool seemed incomparably small. It floated above the long river, and even Luo Fan had almost overlooked it from afar. The vortex looked as tiny as a sesame seed on a huge planet. From afar, the vortex looked like an eye that slowly spun above the long river of the great path. It vaguely gave off a feeling that it controlled and overlooked everything. This was the will of heaven and earth. If living beings who knew about the existence of the will of heaven and earth saw this vortex, they would immediately know this. Compared to the normal will of heaven and earth, the vortex had a light that was different from the previous will of heaven and earth. It was a light that could not be described with words. It was a light that seemed to contain all the colors in the universe, yet it also seemed like no color existed. It was a light that was like a living thing. It was the light of heaven and earth. The moment the vortex appeared, the dark red color above the long river of the great path started spreading in all directions from the point where the vortex was perpendicular to it. Gradually, it began to fade vaguely. It showed signs of returning to the original color of the great path. A faint smile appeared on Luo Fan's face when he saw this. Instincts and willpower are closely connected. My light of heaven and earth has already become the will of heaven and earth. So how can it be so easily isolated by instincts? This thought flashed through his mind. His body directly charged up into the sky against the boundless and terrifying malice. The malice was so strong that it even distorted space-time and messed up the rules and laws. As he charged up, countless terrifying movements began to appear around Luo Fan. Thunder, wind, ghost cries, godly cries, the sound of hard objects breaking, and even all sorts of terrifying movements that could not be described with words appeared around him at this moment. They accompanied him as he charged up the great path above. At this moment, the 9-headed lion, the demon army, and the golden-armored war god, who had regained some of their clarity, all seemed to be guided by something at the same time. They pounced towards Luo Fan in a frenzy. With this pounce, an endless world was created. The entire world began to shake violently under this pounce. It felt as if the world was turning upside down and the stars were moving. Space-time completely collapsed at this moment. The ground completely turned into powder and spread in all directions like a violent gale. Boundless and terrifying light was released from the 9-headed lion, the demons, and the golden-armored war god. Among them, the light from the 9-headed lion was mixed with extremely dense concepts and mysteries, causing the light it released to be tens of times stronger than the light released by the other two parties. It even oppressed the light released by the other two parties to the point of shaking. Currently, the three parties were no longer surrounded by killing intent and karma. Their attacks were less sinister, and instead, they had a grand atmosphere. As it pressed down on Luo Fan, it was as if the power of the entire world was fiercely pressing down on him. The area within a radius of hundreds of millions of light-years had been completely turned into powder in an instant. All the power, all the things that could be squeezed out, and even the phenomena, had been completely turned into power. Along with their attacks, they fiercely pressed towards Luo Fan. This kind of fierce pressure wasn't just a simple pressure of strength. There were also countless mysterious and indescribable impacts from all aspects. Under this impact, Luo Fan not only felt his body being oppressed, but his own strength, his own might, his own mind, and even his own willpower and thoughts were under an incomparably astonishing pressure. Even the miniature world that had turned into a circle of light could not stop all the pressure. There was still a lot of pressure that penetrated the miniature world and directly affected him. Faced with this kind of attack, Luo Fan did not even look over. With just a thought, streams of divine power penetrated the light circle, split into billions of parts, and fiercely penetrated the light that was pressing down on him from all directions at this moment. All the profundities within the light, including the profundities of concept that were the trump cards of era severing, were directly crushed by the wisps of concept ability. As the mysteries were defeated, the countless powers became simple. Those concept divine abilities were just aftershocks, but they had already eliminated all of his power, turning his surroundings into a void. The boundless light, impact, pressure, and even the silhouettes brought about by the power and profundities had all disappeared without a trace. Apart from the circle of light on Luo Fan's body, after erasing these attacks, Luo Fan didn't even bother to pay attention to Duan Shi and the others. He didn't even have the intention to erase them along with him. He raised his hand and the countless concept divine powers he had released before condensed in his hand. Throughout the process there was no light at all. There was not even a trace that appeared like before the abilities were released. It felt like the concept abilities had vanished into thin air after all the power and mysteries had been erased. It was as if they had appeared out of thin air, or as if Luo Fan had recreated them. Although Duan Shi and the others had been completely affected by the natural instincts of the world, their battle experience and battle instincts were still present. After their attacks were erased, they instinctively began to defend themselves in an attempt to completely block the impact that came with the erasing process. However, what they waited for was not an attack. Instead, it was a figure that disappeared before their eyes, disappearing from their line of sight. A figure that charged into the sky and into the long river of the Great Path. This situation of making countless movements and unleashing countless powers to block the attacks coming at them but failing to do so made the three of them look rather comical. On the contrary, the destructive aura from before was completely swept away, and a dazed atmosphere filled the vast region that spanned hundreds of millions of light years. Amidst the daze, the three parties suddenly regained a little clarity. What just happened? Were we ignored? The demon ancestor murmured with disbelief in his eyes. He knew very well how powerful the power that he had gathered with the demon race was. It could be said that even if Duan Shi was right in front of him, he would definitely be able to erase him immediately if he had the chance. But just now, they were ignored. The enemy didn't even have the interest to use their own methods to erase them. How could he react to such an encounter? Chapter 24:20. Master. The martial ancestor beast could not help but be curious. The incident was extremely unjust to the martial ancestor beast. Who was controlling him? Who was his enemy? And why was there a conflict? Everything was a mystery to him. Since the beginning, he had been like a marionette being manipulated into a battle that he did not understand at all, lingering on the line between life and death time and time again. Under such circumstances, it was easy to imagine how many questions he had. At this moment, after listening to Duan Shi's words, he finally grasped some clues about the cause of the battle. How could he not be bothered? At that moment, he hurriedly asked, "The teacher you mentioned, is he our enemy?" Hearing this, Duan Shi's lion head turned around and looked at the demon ancestor with a probing gaze. He said calmly, "If I'm not wrong, it should be him." Duan Shi was considered a legendary figure in this world. Ever since the first great tribulation of the heavens and earth, he had gone through eras after eras, tribulations after tribulations, and upheavals after upheaval of the heavens and earth, but he had always stood firm. Furthermore, His achievements had become greater and greater, and in the end, he had reached a level that ordinary cultivators could only dream of. Many cultivators were extremely curious about such an existence. Among them was the martial ancestor beast. The martial ancestor beast immediately asked, "I've never heard that Senior has a master. Can you tell me more about it? After all, Senior's master is now our enemy." Duan Shi's gaze became complicated. Regarding Luo Fan, his feelings were naturally quite complicated. As for Luo Fan's gratitude, he naturally kept it in mind. However, at the same time, after experiencing so many changes recently, the seed of doubt that was planted in his heart gradually pointed toward Luo Fan. It pointed toward his master, who had always held a supreme position in his heart. Due to the doubt, his gratitude toward Luo Fan had unknowingly wavered. Although it still existed, it was no longer as absolute as it used to be. With such mixed emotions, how could his current mood not become complicated? "I wonder if you've heard of the origin of techniques?" Duan Shi let out a sigh and asked in the end. Hearing this, the beast progenitor shuddered and wore a look of disbelief. To him, the source of the technique was a supreme existence that only existed in ancient myths and legends. It was said that a long time ago, before the first great calamity of the world, this existence had preached the great Tao to all living beings in the world. It could be said that all the cultivation methods and magical powers in this world had traces of the great Tao that he had preached. It could be said that it was the existence known as the origin of the technique that created the foundation of cultivation in this world. For a long time, the demon ancestor had been doubtful whether such an existence really existed. In fact, he was more inclined to believe that the current cultivators were merely trying to find a source for all techniques, just like the legendary creation of the world. However, he did not expect that he would hear the name of a legendary figure from the mysterious Duan Ji in front of him. How could he not be shocked? Could it be that the source of the technique really exists? How was this possible? How could there be such an unbelievable expert in this world? The demon ancestor could not help but exclaim. As he exclaimed, he almost lost control of his mind. He almost fell into the control of the heaven and earth's instincts and lost himself again. Fortunately, the heaven and earth's instincts were no longer focused on them. The influence on him was extremely weak, which allowed him to regain control of his mind at the last moment and stabilize the freedom of his mind. Even so, he broke out in a cold sweat from the shock. Even though there were countless living beings, beasts, and wild beasts in the surroundings, the martial progenitor and Duan Shi were the only ones there. That was because, apart from them, all other living beings were controlled by the heaven and earth's instincts. At this moment, they were only there because they were born to be the leaders of the wild beasts and the demons. Their control over the two races was also recognized by the heaven and earth's instincts. It was because their identity and status were recognized by the heaven and earth's instincts. Therefore, if the two of them did not plan to do anything, the two races would naturally not do anything. Duan Shi sneered when he heard the demon ancestor's disbelief. "You're ignorant. Even in your past life, you were taught by teacher of the technique's source. Strictly speaking, you should call him teacher." The demon ancestor's expression froze when he heard that. He said, "No, I've clearly recovered the memories of my past life. I was just an ordinary cultivator in my past life who died in a great calamity. I've never heard of the technique's source back then." "That's because you didn't dig deep enough. If you dig a few thousand more lives, you'll definitely be able to dig out the memories of the lectures. I still remember that you were just a rogue immortal back then. You were the weakest among the cultivators who attended the lectures. You could only listen at the corner of the door," said Duan Shi. "Is that so?" The demon ancestor finally realized how long Duan Shi's history was. He did not think Duan Shi would lie to him because there was no need for it. Duan Shi would never do something like that either. Since Duan Shi mentioned that he had attended the lectures of the technique's source in his past life, He must have attended the lectures there. I see. It seems like I've underestimated myself. The demon ancestor let out a sigh. For cultivators, their past lives were a part of them too. Therefore, they would usually try their best to retrieve the memories of their past lives. The demon ancestor was no exception. When he had the ability, he had already started to trace back to his past life. Through repeated efforts, he managed to retrieve his memories. Later on, he dug deeper into his past life in an attempt to dig out more memories of his past life. Unfortunately, to him, the only thing he could learn was his past life. As he dug deeper, he realized that he was no longer a cultivator. He was just a mortal. Even if he could transform, he would turn into a beast or a plant. He had a lifespan of tens of thousands of years in his past life. In other words, a lifespan of tens of thousands of years was only one life. However, in the previous life there was a life every few decades. Tracing back to tens of thousands of years, there were hundreds of lives. Because of that, after tracing back hundreds of lives, he felt that it was a waste of time, so he stopped digging. After all, to him, digging out the memories of each life was not only a gain, but also a burden. If he could dig out some beneficial cultivation experiences, it would naturally be a good thing. However, the memories that came one after another were the memories of the mortal world. If he dug them out, he would only be looking for trouble. Perhaps I should continue digging. What kind of Tao is the Tao that the technique's source talks about? He mumbled with an inexplicable look of anticipation on his face. For him, who was already a false sage, it was not difficult for him to dig out the memories of his past life. However, it was obvious that it was not a good time. After all, he was only able to maintain his consciousness because of his firm will and the fact that the heaven and earth did not care about him. Under such circumstances, digging out the memories of his past life was obviously provoking the heaven and earth's instinct. Naturally, he would not do such a stupid thing. Since he could not dig out his own memories to find out about the technique's source, he could only start from Duan Shi, who obviously had memories. He immediately asked, since he's the technique's source, why did teacher become the heaven and earth's enemy? Hearing that, Duan Shi sighed. He raised his 9 lion heads and looked at the great path that covered the sky. After a long time, he said, I don't know either. However, teacher seems to be quite wary of the heaven and earth. There was even a period of time when he hid deep in the void and was unwilling to come out. Perhaps the conflict between him and the heaven and earth has finally reached a point where it can no longer be suppressed. The demon ancestor was a little confused, but he also came to a realization. He did not ask any further and raised his head to look at the sky. At that moment, the void around them had completely turned into nothingness. Even the rules and laws had completely disappeared. It felt like they had directly arrived at the void in the depths of the void. The vastness of this region of nothingness had reached an inconceivable level. It covered an area of hundreds of millions of light years. At a glance, it seemed like they had appeared in the void of the universe and were facing an incomparably huge river above them. A feeling of insignificance arose in their hearts. With such a mentality, none of them dared to rush up to help even though the great path above them had begun to churn and change. As for the gold-armored war god, he seemed to have turned into a statue again. He quietly hovered there and did not even raise his head. Naturally, it was impossible for him to rush up and join the battle. Luo Fan did not look at the reactions of the 3 parties below, nor did he care. Under the current level of the battle, the 3 parties had become insignificant. Even if they gave their all and sacrificed everything, it would still be difficult for them to break through the barrier of the aftermath of the battle and participate in the battle between him and the heaven and earth's great path, or rather, the heaven and earth's instincts. At this moment, his body had already fiercely penetrated the great path above him and charged towards the vortex formed by the light of the world above the great path. The great path was extremely mysterious. It contained endless information and endless mysteries. It even contained the mysteries of all the laws that existed in this world. And all of this was not only constantly crushing towards Luo Fan under the guidance of the heaven and earth's instincts, but even the great path's repulsive force towards all foreign objects was constantly pressing towards him. At this moment, the more he charged up, the more terrifying the resistance became. Moreover, countless cracks continuously appeared on the halo of light around him, causing cracks to appear one after another. If it was not for his concept God art that was constantly mending these cracks, perhaps his world would have already collapsed before he could reach the depths of the great path. At this moment, beams of light shot out from the vortex formed by the light of the world above him. They formed countless threads that smashed downwards and smashed into the great path. They continuously approached Luo Fan, who had already reached the depths of the great path. The great path only produced circles of ripples when it faced the impact of Luo Fan. Even the pressure that appeared was only naturally produced by the parts of the great path that came into contact with him. However, under the impact of the light rays that shot down from the vortex, the great Tao itself began to stir violently. It felt like a python had swallowed a prey that was larger than its body. From the spot where the light rays penetrated, the great Tao began to bulge outward. At this moment, what was produced on the great path was no longer circles of ripples. Instead, what appeared was pieces after pieces of the great path. The great path was an extremely mysterious existence. Time, space, matter, energy, and everything else would be controlled by the great path. Under such circumstances, it was obviously impossible to move through time and space and use all kinds of strange magical powers to bypass the obstruction of the great Tao and arrive behind the great Tao. After all, even an existence like Luo Fan didn't have the right to say that his abilities could surpass the profundities of the great path. Under such circumstances, regardless of whether it was space-time or the various divine abilities, they were obviously unable to avoid being affected by the great path. It was precisely because of this that Luo Fan had chosen to forcefully charge into the great path and charge towards the light of the world above him. Of course, converging was one reason, and attacking the great path was also another reason. In order to surpass this world, it wasn't enough to just leave this world. Instead, he had to make this world submit to him and make the energy of this world truly serve him. It wasn't that he could use it in this world, but that he could still use it after he left this world. Only in this way could this world allow him to exist safely after he left. At the very least, this was the case for the worlds that the fragments encountered during the Great Calamity. After all, to him, the baleful aura of the Great Calamity was not much inferior to the state of chaos. Chapter 24-21. It wasn't an easy task to make the Great Tao yield. At the very least, in the past, Luo Fan wouldn't have dared to have such ambitions, even if it was a great thousand world. However, the situation now was completely different. Although he was facing a perfect replica of the world, which was tens of thousands of times stronger than the Great Thousand World. However, Luo Fan now had the light of heaven and earth, which possessed the will of the world. The will of the world within the light of heaven and earth was in existence on the same level as the will of the world in the perfect world. Such an existence was already extremely effective against the Great Tao in the first place. Even if the light of heaven and earth collided with the Great Tao, there was an extremely slim chance of victory. Not to mention that Luo Fan's light of heaven and earth had already completely replaced the will of the world. He had complete control over everything in the world, apart from his instincts. With such confidence, the light of heaven and earth would naturally have an advantage against the Great Tao, and the chances of victory would naturally be greater. The Great Tao's reaction to the existence that invaded it was extremely intense. Right now, it wasn't just the Great Tao that had been invaded that reacted to Luo Fan. The entire Great Tao was releasing endless power power, and mysteries that constantly crushed towards Luo Fan, as well as the countless strands of light that were hammered down by the light of heaven and earth. To the two of them, the power, and mysteries were extremely great threat. At every moment, Luo Fan felt that he was facing an endless world. It was as if everything outside of his body was attacking him. At this moment, there wasn't much of a reaction from the living beings below. At most, the more powerful beings would look up at the sky out of habit and look at the great chaos that covered the sky and earth. The space-time in this world was already extremely distorted, and the originally chaotic scene didn't calm down at all. Instead, it became even more intense and terrifying. At a glance, the entire world seemed to have lost its order. It had completely turned into a strange light and shadow that was randomly mixed together by the four basic existences of space, time, matter, and energy. If it wasn't for the fact that the chaos wasn't complete enough, or that the great Tao of the world still placed a bit of hope on the living beings of the world, perhaps even the living beings of the world would have been corroded by the chaos that had lost order, assimilated, and become a part of the chaos. Under this change, the world seemed to have become an incomparably huge river of the Great Path. It carried endless chaotic light and shadow as it fought against a certain creature that had invaded the Great Path, as well as the vortex formed by the light of the world that floated above the Great Path. The once flourishing civilization and countless cultivators seemed to have disappeared without a trace at this time. As the light of heaven and earth got closer and closer to Luo Fan, the attack produced by the Great Path became stronger and stronger. In the end, at a certain moment, this attack finally broke through a certain realm, and even the halo of light formed by the world around Luo Fan could no longer resist it. All the cracks broke through their limits in an instant, causing the halo of light to collapse in an instant. I finally can't hold on anymore. Seeing that the miniature world was still collapsing even with the support of his concept ability, Luo Fan could only sigh. As he sighed, the boundless might of the great Tao had already slammed into his body. His body collapsed in the blink of an eye, completely turning into nothingness. Not even a single trace of him remained. He had completely and utterly disappeared without a trace. At this moment, the vortex formed by the light of heaven and earth suddenly trembled, showing signs of collapsing. However, very soon, the light of heaven and earth erupted with intense light once again. The light that had been swaying due to the trembling of the vortex and seemed like it was about to collapse once again strengthened at this moment. However, this time, these rays of light weren't heading downwards towards the direction that Luo Fan was originally charging towards. Instead, they began to spread out like a net, spreading out in all directions. They continued to penetrate deep into the great Tao, inserting themselves into the endless mysteries, principles, and even power of the great Tao. The dark red luster on the Great Path started to weaken rapidly during this process. This weakening speed was not fast, but it was extremely determined. It was a gradual and thorough change. The range of this change corresponded to the range of the net formed by the light of heaven and earth. Wherever the net spread, the light of the Great Path would also spread. Teacher 1. At that moment, the nine-headed lion's 9 heads were filled with shock and bewilderment at the same time where the Great Path's luster had changed. He could no longer see Luo Fan at all. He had no idea what Luo Fan was doing or how far his battle with the world had progressed. However, from the changes in the great Tao and the weakening of his control over his spirit, he suddenly had a thought that he had never dared to imagine before. Perhaps, his teacher had already achieved victory in the battle against the heavens and earth. After all, compared to the dark red Great Path, the Great Path that had changed its luster seemed more peaceful and more in line with the Great Path that he had imagined. Under such circumstances, how could he not suspect that the other side in the battle with the Great Path had already won? At this moment, great changes were also happening on many other planes. In some of these planes, the existences that Luo Fan corresponded to were also annihilated by the existences that corresponded to the Great Path. They were turned into nothingness, and not even a single trace of them remained. However, on an extremely small number of planes, due to the characteristics of the planes and the depth of Luo Fan's control over the existences that corresponded to him, the existences that corresponded to him could still survive the attacks of the existences that corresponded to the Great Path. In fact, they even went one step further and broke through the barriers of the Great Path. They arrived in front of the vortex above and overlapped with it. As the existences that corresponded to Luo Fan in a certain plane overlapped with the existences that corresponded to the light of heaven and earth, in many other planes, including the plane of reality, in the vortex formed by the light of heaven and earth, a figure materialized at the same time. In the plane of reality, this figure was Luo Fan's body in the plane of reality. In the other planes, this figure was the figure that corresponded to Luo Fan's existence in the plane of reality. As this change occurred, the Great Path started to tremble violently. The hostility that had slightly weakened just now instantly skyrocketed again. Moreover, in the blink of an eye, the hostility had skyrocketed to a state that far surpassed the state that Luo Fan's body was in before it was destroyed in the plane of reality. In fact, it wasn't just twice, but 10 times or even 100 times. Duanshi and the demon ancestor, who were below, instantly felt that the bit of clarity in their hearts had instantly crumbled. The moment the clarity in their hearts crumbled, they let out roars and led countless living beings to charge upward. They charged towards the great Tao. Or to be more specific, they were charging towards the vortex above the Great Path. Because the hostility was even stronger, even if the Great Path did not control them instinctively, they could no longer bear it and could no longer maintain their sense of self. Luo Fan naturally did not care about all these changes. At this moment, although the hostility that he encountered was 10 times or even 100 times stronger than before, he was much more relaxed than before due to the protection of the light of heaven and earth. At this moment, his expression was still calm as he looked at the backlash below. With a slight thought, the light of heaven and earth reacted and split into more threads that plunged downwards, forming a net that spread in all directions at an even faster speed. The area that had changed its color became wider and wider, and the color became more and more similar to the light of heaven and earth. As this change occurred, the Great Path itself began to distort intensely. The dark red Great Path outside began to reject the Great Path that had changed its color. A strange distortion appeared at the boundary between the two, causing both sides to violently tremble. Countless tiny cracks appeared on the Great Path, as if both sides could collapse at any time. However, as the silk net continued to spread, this boundary was also constantly pushing outward. It looked quite strange. Faced with such a situation, Luo Fan showed a faint smile on his face. If this situation continued, although he was still a long way from the final victory, he was at least on the right path. Under his command, the light of heaven and earth that had turned into a vortex began to slowly descend, constantly approaching the incomparably huge Great Path River. Vaguely, Luo Fan seemed to sense that the will of heaven and earth within the light of heaven and earth seemed to be rather agitated. Of course, this feeling was extremely vague, and he couldn't even be sure if it was really agitated. After all, even the will of heaven and earth within the light of heaven and earth was still the will of heaven and earth. Its level was much higher than the will of heaven and earth of heaven and earth. Such a will, its way of thinking, and its emotional reactions were all fundamentally different from that of a living being. Under such circumstances, his perception of the will of heaven and earth's emotions could only rely on his previous understanding of the will of heaven and earth to guess, for the light of heaven and earth and the Great Path, an existence like time was merely an attribute that could be changed at will. In what seemed like an instant, but also like tens of thousands of years later, the vortex formed by the light of the heavens and the earth had already arrived above the long river of the Great Path and slowly merged with it. As this change occurred, the will of heaven and earth within the light of heaven and earth began to vibrate intensely. An indescribable suction force began to appear, acting directly on the surrounding great path. The net formed by the surrounding rays of light was like countless hands that began to pull in the surrounding mysteries of the great path and absorb them into the light of heaven and earth, and the will of heaven and earth. As the mysteries of the great path were integrated, the originally illusory will of heaven and earth began to give birth to bits of substance. Countless tiny threads continuously emerged from within the light of heaven and earth. Not only were these threads extremely vague at first, but they were also intermittent and intertwined with each other, appearing extremely chaotic. However, this change alone was enough to make Luo Fan feel that the essence of the light of heaven and earth had obtained some kind of incomprehensible sublimation. It felt as if the light of heaven and earth had walked out of nothingness and possessed some indescribable reality. How could there be such a change? Even Luo Fan couldn't help but be shocked by this change. Although he had condensed the light of heaven and earth bit by bit, his level was still too low compared to the will of heaven and earth. However, his level was still too low compared to the will of heaven and earth after all. Therefore, he had no idea what the light of heaven and earth would evolve into, or what the light of heaven and earth would desire in the future. He didn't expect that the light of heaven and earth would actually undergo such an unbelievable sublimation after devouring a bit of the great path. This effect almost completely overturned his understanding of the light of heaven and earth. If I had known that I could devour the great path to grow, would I have needed to scheme so much? After a long time, he couldn't help but feel an indescribable sense of helplessness. The light of heaven and earth had already gained the right to come into contact with the great path a long time ago. If he had known that the light of heaven and earth could devour the great path to grow and even sublimate, why would he have needed to plan so much, calculate so much, and waste so much time? If he had thrown the light of heaven and earth onto the great path and allowed it to devour the great path completely, wouldn't this world be like his backyard, where he could transcend if he wanted to? Xian lamented for a long time. In the end, Luo Fan sighed and got rid of all these distracting thoughts. It didn't matter if he regretted it or not, for now, the past was the past. The most important thing now was to let the light of heaven and earth devour the great path as much as possible. Either he could devour the great path completely, or he could let the light of heaven and earth grow to the limit of its growth through devouring the great path. With a thought, he immediately began to work hard to control the light of heaven and earth to spread out more and more threads, making those threads spread out as much as possible. The great path was an extremely mysterious existence. It wasn't tangible, nor was it illusory, nor was it half real and half illusory. In it, all the mysteries contained in the great path could evolve into all kinds of unimaginable things. Time, space, matter, energy, rules, laws, and even the world, heaven and earth, not to mention living beings. Chapter 24-22. Such a situation was countless times more mysterious than the rejection and pressure from the spontaneous reaction of the Grand Tao from before. The reason for this was simple. Even though the great Tao had been eroded and repelled him, it was still just like how ordinary living beings repelled existences they hated. No matter how strong the rejection was, it could only resist with a portion of the living being's power. But the situation was completely different now. Luo Fan was using his world light to devour the Grand Tao. For the Grand Tao, it was equivalent to a knife slicing its windpipe. The pressure of being on the verge of death was enough to make the Grand Tao unleash all of its potential. It was just like how a person's struggle before death was usually the strongest. However, Luo Fan no longer had the mood to care about the current situation. At this moment, he was wholeheartedly resisting the Grand Tao's struggle, resisting the unimaginably terrifying pressure. Even with the world light protecting him, he could still clearly feel the changes being produced by the Grand Tao at every moment, which were tens of thousands of times more intense than usual. All these changes intertwined and formed a violent effect that impacted his cultivation achievement. It caused his worldview, his concept, his divine abilities, his sense of self, and his life essence to be constantly shaken. It was imaginable that if it wasn't for the world light protecting him, even if he didn't completely lose himself, his body and mind would be greatly damaged. Even the worldview that he had spent a great deal of effort to sort out would be shaken. However, this difference was enough to completely overturn the entire situation. Now that he had the protection of the light of the heavens and earth, and the light of the heavens and earth became his last source of confidence, he was able to maintain his clarity during this process. In the end, he began to absorb and fuse the various mysteries revealed by this change bit by bit. In the end, it strengthened and perfected his worldview of laws. During this process, the light of the heavens and the earth constantly split into threads and expanded the network. The speed at which it devoured the great path also increased. At this moment, Duanshur, the demon ancestor, the many demons, and the golden-armored war god that was formed in the human space had all charged into the Grand Tao. They were instinctively supported by the great path. Although they were foreign objects, they had a strong affinity with the great path around them. Under this kind of affinity, they didn't encounter any obstructions when they entered the great Tao. Instead, it allowed the great Tao to facilitate their advance. When their bodies collided with the net formed by the light of the universe, they were already covered in a huge amount of smoke. Endless destructive power flowed out of their bodies and fused with the surrounding smoke. They followed the smoke and frantically collided with the net formed by the light of the universe. At this moment, a strange sound was constantly emitted from the point of contact between the two. The sound was so strange. Even though the entire world was in a state of chaos, it was still so obvious and clear. Moreover, any living being that heard the sound would naturally have an extremely strong image in their hearts. It was as if they had seen the entire process of the smoke colliding with the threads that devoured the Grand Tao with their own eyes. Meanwhile, Luo Fan, who was floating in the vortex of the light of the universe, was sitting cross-legged with a calm expression. His tightly shut eyes didn't change at all. It felt like he had turned into a strange statue. He didn't react at all to the light of the universe's actions and the impact of the light of the universe's network. After the smoke around the living beings collided with the light of the universe's net, it didn't affect the net at all. Instead, the smoke started to collapse, and in the end, it was reflected on the living beings, causing them to collapse and perish. When the confrontation between the two reached its peak, the impact had already spread to every world on the nine-headed lion that Duanshur had transformed into. It had even spread to the countless demons and every living being in the human space. Soon after, an earth-shattering and terrifying crisp sound rang out of nowhere. The living beings that were affected by the impact completely collapsed in an instant. They turned into powder and disappeared without a trace in the blink of an eye. As they dissipated, the smoke and endless power that were originally their foundation lost its support. It could no longer resist the light of the universe's network. Under the impact of the light of the universe, it rapidly declined and completely collapsed in a short while, disappearing without a trace. After the living beings that were controlled by the hostility were completely destroyed, the changes of the Grand Tao finally affected the many light figures below, affecting all the living beings within. The entire world, which was already chaotic, instantly became even more chaotic. There were even some spots where the chaotic light had completely collapsed, turning into nothingness from the inside out. Then, as if they had never existed, they disappeared without a trace. However, Luo Fan didn't sense any of this at all. At this moment, his worldview finally showed visible growth for the first time in a long time. The benefits of the devouring Grand Tao were mostly taken away by the light of the universe. However, Luo Fan was the master of the light of the universe after all. In the end, he still had the ability to forcefully dig out some benefits from the light of the universe's teeth. To him, this little bit of benefit was already an unimaginably huge harvest. The Grand Tao was an extremely mysterious existence. Comprehending the Grand Tao and devouring Grand Tao were completely different from comprehending or devouring other objects. If it was other ordinary objects, such as heavenly treasures, comprehending the Grand Tao was to comprehend some of the principles and mysteries contained in the heavenly treasures. Once comprehended, these principles and mysteries would naturally belong to the person. Unless the memory of the comprehension was completely erased, the comprehension could not be erased no matter what method was used. Devouring, on the other hand, was to directly devour the heavenly treasures and obtain the body of the heavenly treasures without obtaining the principles and mysteries contained in the heavenly treasures. For the Grand Tao, comprehending and devouring were fundamentally different from ordinary objects, such as heavenly treasures. For the Grand Tao, comprehending and devouring were equivalent to copying a book. No matter how much you copied, no matter how well you copied, it didn't mean that you could completely learn the principles recorded in the book. Of course, this didn't exclude the fact that there were a few people with strong learning abilities who could learn the principles in the book through this method. In fact, it didn't exclude people who could comprehend some principles far beyond what was recorded in the book through analogy. However, devouring the Grand Tao was different. Devouring the Grand Tao was equivalent to directly devouring the principles recorded in the book and directly integrating them into one's heart. Naturally, it was equivalent to directly obtaining all the principles in the book. It was precisely because of this that in the past, no matter how many times Luo Fan comprehended the Grand Tao, no matter how much time he spent to deeply comprehend the Grand Tao, it was equivalent to scratching an itch through his boot. He couldn't obtain the true essence of the Grand Tao at all. At the very least, with Luo Fan's current realm, he couldn't obtain the true essence of the Grand Tao at all. In contrast, he directly used the light of heaven and earth to devour the Grand Tao. Even if he only obtained a little bit of the Grand Tao that leaked out from the light of heaven and earth, it was already an extremely huge improvement compared to the past. What he obtained was far from what he had obtained by directly comprehending the Grand Tao in the past. Luo Fan's worldview relied on this process to slowly absorb nutrients from the Grand Tao. Many of its imperfections and flaws were perfected and made up for bit by bit. While Luo Fan was completely immersed in the process of resisting the pressure of the Grand Tao and the endless mysteries contained in it, the changes in the light of heaven and earth were also continuing. The endless threads that had just appeared in the light of heaven and earth were constantly increasing, and the originally illusory and blurry areas were constantly decreasing. All the threads became more and more realistic as time passed, and the existence that the threads ultimately formed gradually took on an outline. It was a pillar that seemed to pierce through the light of heaven and earth. It even gave off a feeling that it was going to pierce through the light of heaven and earth, and extend beyond the light of heaven and earth. Of course, although it was a pillar, there were so many details on the pillar that it was no less complicated than any existence. Whether it was the Grand Tao, the concept divine ability, the worldview, or even the legendary Tao of the sage, in terms of complexity, it seemed that they could only be compared to this pillar. They couldn't suppress this pillar at all. It was precisely because of this that there was a need for such a huge number of threads to be constantly born and connected, in a situation where this world had already become so chaotic. The attribute of time no longer had any meaning. After an unknown amount of time, it seemed to have been billions of years, but it also seemed to have only been a few breaths. The dark red light on the Grand Tao that traversed the heaven and earth had completely disappeared. The entire Grand Tao had already been filled with the endless threads of light of heaven and earth. No matter where on the Grand Tao was, whether it was near or far from the center, whether it was conspicuous or hidden, a large number of threads could be found in everything. Compared to before, the current Grand Tao seemed to have been completely reconstructed from the light of heaven and earth. At this moment, the vortex formed by the light of heaven and earth had already shrunk to the extent that it only wrapped around Luo Fan's body. It looked like Luo Fan's body was emitting a faint brilliance. However, all the light of heaven and earth had been completely divided into countless threads during this process, and they were scattered throughout the entire Grand Tao. At this point, the chaos in this world, which had been maintained for an unknown amount of time, had instead started to weaken. A strange order began to slowly re-establish itself in this world. Time and space were divided again, matter and energy were reconstructed, and laws were constructed at a speed that seemed slow but was actually extremely fast. As for living creatures, they reappeared one after another, gradually adding an unknown amount of vitality to the world. The original scene of the end of the world began to gradually fade. However, this Grand Tao didn't seem to be much different from before on the surface. However, the attribute of the heaven and earth inside was completely different from before. The entire Grand Tao revealed a charm that belonged to Luo Fan. A charm that belonged to the laws and worldview. Traces of the laws and worldview could be found at the root of the many laws and worldview. The entire Grand Tao wasn't so much the original Grand Tao as the Grand Tao, a Grand Tao that was constructed based on the laws and worldview. Evidently, although this Grand Tao could be reconstructed, everything was based on Luo Fan's light of heaven and earth. The light of heaven and earth was based on Luo Fan himself, his spirit, and his comprehension of cultivation. In other words, it was based on the laws and worldview. Under such circumstances, with the light of heaven and earth as the template for the Grand Tao that was ultimately born would naturally be based on the laws and worldview. The moment the order of this Grand Tao was truly re-established, Luo Fan shut his eyes for an unknown period of time. Has it been completely devoured? This thought flashed through his mind. The reason for this was because he could already feel that the extremely terrifying pressure that the Grand Tao had exerted on him over the past few days had completely disappeared. At this moment, he only felt an indescribable sense of ease and satisfaction as he was enveloped by the light of heaven and earth. Apart from that, he didn't feel the slightest bit of discomfort. This feeling was enough to tell him that the outside world's environment had undergone a huge change. Based on the light of heaven and earth's previous actions, it was quite possible that the light of heaven and earth had completely devoured the Grand Tao. With this speculation, there was a trace of disappointment in his eyes. It was indeed a good thing that the light of heaven and earth had completely devoured the Grand Tao. It meant that he had already achieved his goal and could transcend this Grand Tao at any time, allowing this fragment to return to its original form. However, from another perspective, this was also a bad thing. This was because without the light of heaven and earth devouring the Grand Tao, it was impossible for him to devour the Grand Tao anymore. After all, the Grand Tao was an extremely mysterious existence that he still couldn't understand. Previously, he could only devour the Grand Tao by relying on the light of heaven and earth, which was also an existence that surpassed his understanding, to fight against the Grand Tao. In other words, he didn't really have the ability to devour the Grand Tao and directly seize the mysteries contained within it. Instead, it was the light of heaven and earth that helped him chew up the Grand Tao before feeding it back to him. Chapter 24-23. What a waste of such a good opportunity! Luo Fan sighed inwardly. With a thought, the light of heaven and earth around him began to flicker rapidly. As it flickered, the countless threads of light of heaven and earth that had been scattered all over the path began to rapidly shrink. As the threads shrank, the path also began to converge towards where he was. At first, the threads felt extremely difficult to shrink. Although they were still fast, they were still moving at a speed visible to the naked eye. If they continued to shrink at this speed, it would probably take tens of thousands of years for all the threads to be retracted. However, it was clear that this was only the beginning. As time passed, the threads and the path shrank faster and faster, becoming more and more exaggerated. In the end, they were so fast that they couldn't be seen with the naked eye. Looking from outside the path, one could no longer see the threads. One could only see a blurry shadow constantly flickering. It was obvious that the speed at which the threads were shrinking was far too fast. It had already surpassed the range of what living beings and even cultivators could see clearly. As the countless threads and paths shrank, the light of heaven and earth around Luo Fan began to thicken. The vortex that was originally only a name without any substance was also rebuilt. In just a few days, the net and path that would have taken tens of thousands of years to completely shrink had completely shrunk around Luo Fan's body. It became a huge vortex that floated in the void like the sun. Compared to this vortex, Luo Fan's current body seemed extremely small. It felt like he was a speck of dust on the surface of a star. Such a size was already extremely vast, but compared to the original Great Tao, it was already billions of times smaller. The vortex spun slowly in the void, emitting mysterious fluctuations that permeated the entire world. It permeated all the laws of heaven and earth, all time and space, all matter and energy, and even the bodies of all living beings. As the waves permeated, the entire world also began to slowly shrink towards the light of heaven and earth. The laws of heaven and earth, time, energy, and everything else slowly shrank towards the vortex. It felt like the waves emitted from the vortex were like fishing lines. After being released into space, they began to hook everything that could be hooked into the vortex. Similarly, at the beginning, this kind of convergence speed was extremely slow. It was like using an ordinary fishing line to catch a whale. It was a feeling of powerlessness. However, as time passed, as more and more parts of the world entered the vortex, the hooking became faster and faster. In the end, even the light and shadows in the entire world became blurry, causing the laws of heaven and earth that had originally stabilized to distort once again. It looked as if there was an invisible giant mouth that was constantly swallowing this part of the world. The light of heaven and earth became thicker and thicker with this change. The pillar that had been condensed over the past few days also began to distort subtly. This pillar was now incomparably solid and complete. Although its surface was not very smooth, but rather rough, no one could say that this pillar was incomplete. It could not be said that this pillar was not indomitable when taken out. However, as the world was continuously pulled into the light of heaven and earth, the pillar seemed to be under some kind of indescribable pressure. It began to undergo all kinds of indescribable changes. As a whole, the pillar began to distort subtly during this process. The distortions were not obvious at first. It only caused the various parts of the pillar to deflect slightly. On the whole, it still looked like a pillar. At most, it was a pillar that was crudely made. However, as time passed, as the light of heaven and earth devoured the world outside faster and faster, and as more and more parts of the world were devoured, the distortions on the pillar became larger and more obvious. In the end, the pillar even looked crooked and twisted. It no longer looked like a pillar. On the contrary, it looked like an existence that Luo Fan was more familiar with, roots. A strange root that was as huge as a heavenly pillar that could almost support the world. Combined with the increasingly rough appearance of the pillar, the roots looked more and more solid, and more realistic. Although the roots were still changing and not fixed, and even the surface was constantly changing at this moment, all the rough spots were constantly moving and undulating, but just its current appearance was already extremely extraordinary. It wasn't just their inconceivable size, but the structure of the roots, the undulations on the surface of the roots, the twisted state of the roots, and even the way they trembled contained inconceivable profundities and unimaginable principles. It felt like the root was the great Tao of a perfect world. No matter from which angle, no matter how one looked at it, even its aura seemed to contain all the mysteries in the world and the universe. It contained supreme mysteries that were enough to make all cultivators scramble for it. At this moment, the entire world seemed to be filled with endless flashes of light and shadows that were constantly flickering and shrinking. Outside the world, the existence that seemed to be in a state of chaos but was actually a boundless great calamity, baleful chi began to surge slightly. It continuously surged in from all directions, and the space left behind by the shrinking of the world exerted greater and greater pressure on the world. When this kind of pressure acted on the world, it instead forced the world to rush into the world at an even faster speed, causing the world to shrink even faster. If it was according to the initial time, the entire world might need tens of millions of years in Luo Fan's opinion to finish shrinking. However, according to the current speed of improvement, the entire world would definitely completely pour into the light of heaven and earth in less than 100 years and become a part of the light of heaven and earth. Compared to the great improvements he had obtained after absorbing the great ways, his body had expanded by many times. Now that he had absorbed the physical world, the physical spacetime, the physical matter and energy, the changes to the light of the world were much smaller. His body did not expand much because of this. Only the light of heaven and earth itself became more real and condensed, and the huge root inside the light of heaven and earth became more mysterious and wondrous. What absorbed the incorporeal body was the expansion of the great Tao itself, which was composed of infinite mysteries. On the contrary, the world that absorbed the incorporeal body would not change. This kind of change, which was almost the complete opposite of common sense, was very mysterious. It made Luo Fan feel that there was some kind of indescribable comprehension in his heart. Everything in the world was decided by the great Tao. No matter how seemingly unrelated it was to the great Tao, as long as it was in this world, it was rooted in the great Tao. In this way, the light of heaven and earth that had devoured the great Tao could naturally easily suppress all resistance and backlash from the world. It could easily return everything in the world to its origin, turning it into nutrients for the light of heaven and earth's growth, allowing the light of heaven and earth to grow unimaginably. In Luo Fan's senses, time passed minute by minute. In the first few years, although the outside world was already blurry, he could still see the changes in the world. However, after more than 10 years, the speed of the changes in the outside world had far exceeded the imagination of any living creature. Even Luo Fan's eyes couldn't keep up with the changes. The light and shadow that he saw in the outside world had also changed from the originally blurry and distorted appearance of the world to an endless stream of light. The light of heaven and earth's devouring and absorption of the outside world felt like endless flowing light was constantly pouring into the light of heaven and earth from all directions, turning into nutrients for the light of heaven and earth's growth, allowing the light of heaven and earth to grow. The evolution of the light of heaven and earth had countless benefits for Luo Fan. There was naturally no need to mention the strengthening of the light of heaven and earth. At the end of the day, this could be seen as the benefits of the light of heaven and earth itself. More importantly, as the world was devoured, there were strands of profundities constantly fluctuating in the light of the world. The surging of these mysteries was naturally insignificant to the endless mysteries contained in the light of heaven and earth. However, for Luo Fan, these mysteries were already incomparably vast. After many mysteries poured into his body and mind, it made him feel that his inspiration was surging. His understanding of the world of laws was almost like the millions of years he had spent sorting out the world of laws. At every moment, he could think of endless inspiration, endless ideas to transform and perfect this world of laws. With this change, he could no longer be bothered to pay attention to everything around him. He just focused all his attention on his heart, on his world of laws, and on the sparkling mysteries. Time flew by amidst this change, and before he knew it, more than 100 years had passed. In such a day, Luo Fan suddenly felt something and shifted his attention from the depths of his heart. At this moment, the boundless darkness suppressed the endless streams of light from the outside and rushed towards the light of heaven and earth. This darkness was so grand, so vast, and had a faint aura of primal chaos. However, it was fundamentally different from the primal chaos that Luo Fan knew. It felt as if it was some kind of strange simulation. The world is about to be completely absorbed? At this moment, Luo Fan came to a realization. Clearly, this meant that this region of the world had been completely absorbed by the light of the world. What existed behind the streams of light was the boundless great calamity evil chi outside the world. Transcend without transcending. Immediately after, another inexplicable thought appeared in Luo Fan's mind. He had originally planned to borrow the power of the great Tao after taming it and borrow the power of this world to leave this world and transcend it. However, he didn't expect that the light of heaven and earth would not only completely tame the great Tao of this world, but it even went a step further and directly devoured the great Tao. Then, it took the opportunity to devour the entire world. At this point, why would he still need to borrow the power of this world to transcend it? Just the light of heaven and earth alone was enough for him to transcend this world, allowing him to freely move about in the boundless great calamity evil chi. The entire process was many times smoother than he had imagined. In fact, there was even a hint of success when the conditions were right. Just as he was immersed in his thoughts, the last stream of light had already rushed into his light of heaven and earth. Immediately after, endless darkness fiercely slammed into his light of heaven and earth. Boom, 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 like a boundless thunderclap, an endless hurricane instantly formed in Luo Fan's mind. At this moment, an endless and terrifying impact frantically poured into his body and mind from the light of heaven and earth, making him feel as if his body and mind were trembling crazily. So strong. As this thought flashed through his mind, Luo Fan crazily stirred up the world view of the laws in his body. Infinite concept spirit power was constantly generated inside his body, pouring into his whole body, and even into his soul. After these concept God powers were poured in, the terrifying impact directly acted on these concept God powers, causing them to constantly tremble and even collapse. This trembling and collapse also made Luo Fan feel a rather strong impact. However, compared to the direct impact on his body and mind, this was already separated by a layer, after all. Most of the impact had already been dispersed. Under such circumstances, it had finally been reduced to a range that he could bear. At this moment, Luo Fan finally had the mood to pay attention to the changes in his body. Looking at it, he couldn't help smiling bitterly. Fortunately, he didn't directly rush out of that world. Otherwise, he would have been instantly erased by the boundless great calamity evil chi. At this moment, his body had almost completely collapsed. At first glance, his entire body seemed intact, but as long as one took a closer look, one would find that his body had already been shattered into countless dust-sized fragments. If it wasn't for the restriction of his will and the light of heaven and earth on him, his body would have completely collapsed and turned into nothingness. However, even though this was the case, his body still appeared a little blurry. The outline of his body and the borders were swiftly dispersing with countless tiny specks of dust. Chapter 24:24. In that instant, the terrifying impact from outside was clearly caused by the gap left behind by the disappearance of heaven and earth. However, it was not because the boundless ominous aura outside possessed such terrifying pressure. Very soon, after the light of heaven and earth withstood the pressure from the outside gradually decreased. Unknowingly, it had already shrunk to a point where Luo Fan could hardly feel it. Evidently, the pressure had already shrunk to the point where the light of heaven and earth could completely withstand it. Faced with this situation, Luo Fan heaved a sigh of relief. If the pressure from the ominous aura outside had maintained its previous intensity, even if he could withstand the impact just now, he would not be able to withstand the endless impact. In the end, he would not be able to withstand it. Of course, this was to be expected. It must be known that his light of heaven and earth had completely devoured everything in that world. Previously, that part of the world could already exist freely in the great calamity baleful chi without being affected. Now that the light of heaven and earth had devoured the world, It naturally had the same ability to exist peacefully in the great calamity baleful Qi without being affected. After recovering, Luo Fan's heart moved slightly. The fragment trembled slightly, and a subtle change occurred. "I've finally broken free from a fragment," he murmured. His eyes looked outwards, and his gaze was extremely deep. It was as if he had already seen through countless obstacles and seen countless scenes in the world. In that instant, his cultivation realm began to rise rapidly. From being restricted in that world to being in tribulation, he began to break through crazily. In the blink of an eye, he had already reached his peak, reaching the peak of a fifth tribulation expert. Although it was only a fragment, it felt as though it was comparable to his complete body. Evidently, he had completely recovered his consciousness at this moment. With this fragment as a carrier and the light of heaven and earth as a communication bridge, his consciousness in the other worlds had truly been strung together, directly assembling into his complete consciousness within this fragment. It was also because of this that his cultivation was no longer restricted by this fragment, and he had recovered to his peak state. In fact, due to the various comprehensions he received from the fragments in the various worlds, his current cultivation realm faintly surpassed that of when he was at his peak. He seemed to be undergoing some sort of indescribable breakthrough. When the consciousnesses of the fragments were strung together, everything that was happening in the fragments seemed to be happening in his consciousness. In the blink of an eye, he had gained complete control over the trillions of fragments that he had scattered across the heavens and earth. Compared to the fragment in the world where the three-eyed and four-elbows-born Taoism aptitude was, the light of heaven and earth had already devoured the great path and the world, naturally transcending when the conditions were right. Although the speed of the other fragments varied, even the fastest one was still extremely far away from this step. Among them, the fastest fragment had only just reached the pinnacle of the world and had begun to faintly influence the general trend of the world. It did not even have the right to directly meet the world's will, let alone completely devour the world's will and the great path. If he continued to wait like this, he might have to wait for trillions of years before all the fragments in the world could transcend. Moreover, after experiencing the benefits of the world just now, he had already developed even more ideas. This might be a great opportunity. I can't devour the perfect world in the normal state of chaos. If I want to devour the world, perhaps I can only start from this great tribulation. As he thought of this, a faint smile appeared on his face. After all, the perfect world in the outside world existed in a state of chaos. For such an existence, not to mention its own world's will, its great path was countless times more powerful than the world that had evolved in this sixth great tribulation. If he wanted to use the light of heaven and earth to devour it, the difficulty would be tens of thousands of times more difficult than in this great tribulation. In other words, even if he could do it, how could he withstand the impact of the state of chaos after devouring the world? Just the impact of the great tribulation, evil Qi after the world was devoured in the Great Tribulation, had almost killed him. His existence had been completely erased. There was no need to mention how much stronger the true state of chaos was compared to the ominous aura of this Great Tribulation. Under such circumstances, the moment he devoured the world in the state of chaos in the outside world, the impact of the state of chaos would definitely completely erase him. At that time, the light of heaven and earth might be severely damaged, and it would be even more impossible for his imprint to remain. Therefore, it could be said that if he wanted to devour the perfect world that truly existed in the state of chaos in the outside world, outside the Great Tribulation, he would simply be courting death with his current level. Due to these various reasons, the only chance for him to let the light of heaven and earth reap the benefits from before was clearly at this moment. Only in this great tribulation, only in the unknown trillions of worlds within the ominous aura of this great tribulation. After understanding this, his eyes shone brightly as he looked at the boundless darkness in front of him, feeling as if he was looking at a huge treasure vault, just one world alone was enough to bring him great benefits after devouring it, and now there were countless trillions of perfect worlds in the darkness. If he completely devoured all these worlds, how many benefits would it bring him? Will it cause my light of heaven and earth to completely evolve into something similar to a primordial origin spirit treasure? Such a crazy possibility emerged in his mind. As this crazy thought came to him, he became even more motivated. Even though he clearly knew that the possibility of this crazy thought becoming a reality was extremely small after making up his mind moved slightly, and his will began to condense towards the fragment that had begun to affect the general trend of the world. In the blink of an eye, he felt that he had broken through layers of barriers, and directly guarded his heart. He went deep into a certain realm of his heart, and directly arrived in a strange world within his heart. The appearance of the born Taoism body in this world was also not the one that Luo Fan was familiar with. Instead, it looked like an octopus. The entire world was extremely strange, as it was filled with boundless seawater. In other words, the air in this world was actually already in a state as thick as seawater. In such a world, living beings that could be born and grow naturally looked like living beings in the water. Of course, compared to the average seabed, this world was after all many times wider, and its ecological structure was also many times more complicated than that of the average seabed. Among them, there were countless living beings that Luo Fan had never even imagined existed in this world, and they used various methods to create all sorts of indescribably prosperous civilizations. The fragment that Luo Fan had here naturally turned into the appearance of the born Taoism body in this world. In other words, it looked similar to an octopus. There's actually such a born Taoism body. It seems that any living being can really achieve Tao. Looking at his own fragment, Luo Fan could not help but sigh to himself. It must be known that this world was copied from the state of chaos, and it had a perfect world that truly existed as a template. The living beings that existed in this world obviously also had a real template. Since the born Taoist body in this part of the world looked like an octopus, it meant that in the state of chaos, there was also a similar creature that had become a true sage. After all, only those who were true saints or even above could truly create a perfect world in the state of chaos. The appearance of the born Taoism body was obviously the appearance of the true saints or even above who had created this world. This fragment had maintained this appearance for tens of thousands of years. In this great calamity, the flow of time in this world was obviously completely different. In the previous three-eyed, four-elbow-shaped world, Luo Fan's fragment had already passed for such a long time, but in this place, only a few 100 million years had passed. This amount of time was enough for the civilization of this world to develop to a certain peak, and it was also enough for a large number of cultivators to appear in this world. However, it was impossible for them to reach a high level. After all, the way this world developed was not much different from a normal world. It was fundamentally different from the continuous tribulations in the world with 3 eyes and 4 elbows. As for why this difference would cause the level of cultivators to be lacking, the reason was even simpler. Without the continuous tribulations, the world would not be able to give too much blessings to the cultivators in it, and it would not be able to give them too many blessings. This naturally caused the cultivators in this world to have to rely on themselves if they wanted to improve even a little bit. In contrast, in the world with 3 eyes and 4 elbows, the tribulations were continuous. In order to help living beings overcome the tribulations, the world naturally gave them endless grace, and in the end, the growth of the cultivators was naturally extremely fast. However, this was only for ordinary living beings. Currently, the fragment of Luo Fan in this world had already climbed to the level of a tribulation stage powerhouse after hundreds of millions of years. It was no weaker than the fragment in the world with 3 eyes and 4 elbows. At this moment, the fragment in this world had already reached the peak of the world. In this world, his status had reached a level where no one dared to challenge him. At this level, a single word from him was enough to cause a huge change in the world. In turn, he could affect the general situation of this world. When Luo Fan's consciousness descended into this world, boundless comprehension and power poured into his body in this world. As all of this poured in, the fragment's cultivation realm began to rise rapidly. In the blink of an eye, it broke through the boundary and stepped into the level of a second tribulation powerhouse. In the blink of an eye, it surpassed the second tribulation powerhouse and reached the level of a third tribulation powerhouse. However, at this point, its body began to tremble violently. It was as if all the connection between its cells had been wiped out, and it looked like it was going to collapse in the next instant. This situation was very obvious. The fragment could no longer withstand further breakthroughs in cultivation realm. It's a pity that it's still not a true-born Taoism aptitude. Sensing the changes in his body, Luo Fan could not help but sigh. At this moment, he was extremely clear about the reason for the changes in his body. This change was not because his body was not strong enough, but because the appearance of his body was fundamentally different from the appearance of his born Taoism aptitude. After all, in terms of body strength, this fragment was not much different from the fragment that had transcended its own world. That fragment could easily withstand all of his cultivation realm and directly raise its cultivation realm to the peak of his body, or even surpass it. Clearly, if it was only limited by strength, he should have been able to achieve similar breakthroughs in this body. However, this was not the case. Right now, he had only risen to the level of a third tribulation powerhouse, but his body was already unable to withstand it and was about to completely collapse. This was clearly because the structure and appearance of this body conflicted with his comprehension of cultivation. But it's enough. With a change of thought, a strange smile appeared on Luo Fan's face again. He looked up at the sky, and his eyes seemed to pierce through endless obstacles and see the world's will hidden somewhere in the depths of the void. The world's will here was not fundamentally different from the world's will in the 3 eyes and 4 elbows world. Luo Fan had already controlled the world's light to devour the 3 eyes and 4 elbows world's will, so he naturally knew where the world's will resided. Using the location of the world's will, he quickly found the location of the world's will. The instant his eyes landed on the will of the heaven and earth, the will of the heaven and earth trembled violently, and a tremendous might was released from it. A strange distortion suddenly appeared in the sky. Chapter 24-25. Such a strong reaction. Just how weak is it? Luo Fan couldn't help but sigh as he watched the changes in the void above him. He had only taken a glance at the will of the world, and it had reacted so strongly. It was as if it was about to appear and attack him. He had never encountered such a situation before. Of course, he had never used such a method to spy on the will of the world before. Perhaps this was a normal reaction of the will of the world? At this moment, a faintly discernible vortex appeared in the void. This vortex didn't exist in the eyes of ordinary living beings, but in Luo Fan's eyes, it was so real and so obvious. With a glance, he could even feel an indescribable gaze shooting out from the center of the vortex and shrouding his body. Sensing this change, Luo Fan's expression changed slightly. With a faint smile, many tentacles moved upwards at the same time. As these tentacles stretched out, boundless concept God art rushed out of his many tentacles and rushed towards the vortex above. These concept God powers had already surpassed time and laws. As soon as they appeared, they had already hit the vortex above. The vortex began to tremble slightly at this moment, and most of those concept God powers were completely wiped out and disappeared without a trace. Only a small portion of the concept God powers that were left seemed to have fulfilled some unknown conditions. They crossed the obstruction of the vortex and rushed into the center of the vortex. Through the center of the vortex, they were transmitted to the residence of the will of the world and fiercely collided with the will of the world. There was no sound or movement from this collision. As for light and shadow, there wasn't even the slightest bit of movement. Luo Fan could only feel that after his concept God powers collided with the will of the world, there wasn't any reaction at all. The will of the world had already eliminated it, and there wasn't any effect at all. It felt like the existence of the concept God powers had been directly erased. Faced with this situation, Luo Fan, who had experience dealing with the will of the world, had already understood. The will of the world was probably lacking, in other words, a portion of the world's will had left the world's will and left the residence of the world's will. No wonder his reaction was so intense. It turns out that he doesn't have the confidence. This thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind, and he could not help but reveal a faint smile on his face. The nature of the concept divine ability was extremely mysterious. It was formed from the sublimation of concepts, and its nature was actually somewhat similar to the will of heaven and earth. Of course, this similarity was similar to diamond and graphite. Perhaps they were of the same nature, but due to various differences, the two were worlds apart. Under such circumstances, if the will of heaven and earth was already complete, and there were no gaps in its body at all, then when these concepts collided with the will of heaven and earth, they would not be erased. Instead, they would be directly bounced off and even have a backlash. In turn, they would be forced by the will of heaven and earth to attack Luo Fan. However, the situation was different this time. At this moment, the will of the heaven and earth had completely erased the will of the heaven and earth. This was clearly the result of the will of the heaven and earth being unstable. Once it was stimulated, it would naturally release some of its power. After realizing this, many thoughts emerged in Luo Fan's mind. If a part of the will of the heaven and earth was missing, where was that part? This was actually nonsense. The will of the heaven and earth was the will of the heaven and earth, and this heaven and earth was equivalent to its body. The missing part of this heaven and earth could naturally only be in this heaven and earth, and it could not be outside of this heaven and earth. Since it was in this heaven and earth, there was actually no need to say where it was. The missing will of the heaven and earth in this heaven and earth must have been reincarnated into this heaven and earth, and become a living creature of this heaven and earth. Or it could be the born Taoism aptitude of this heaven and earth, which was a living creature that looked like an octopus, or it could be something else. As these thoughts flashed through his mind, Luo Fan had already made up his mind on what to do next. As all sorts of thoughts flashed through Luo Fan's mind, the vortex above had already begun to react to Luo Fan's actions. At this moment, countless bolts of lightning shot down from the vortex and fiercely smashed towards Luo Fan. These bolts of lightning were so terrifying that wherever they passed, the surrounding seawater evaporated crazily, forming a region that seemed like a vacuum. Countless bubbles formed and surged in all directions, making the scene look extremely lively. These bolts of lightning seemed to have surpassed time and fiercely landed on Luo Fan's head. They frantically seeped into his body and destroyed it crazily. Boom! With a crisp sound, Luo Fan's body collapsed with a loud bang. In the blink of an eye, he had already turned into nothingness and disappeared without a trace. As he disappeared, the vortex above the void seemed to have lost its target. As it squirmed slightly, it gradually faded and finally disappeared without a trace, as if it had never existed. After a while, the various turbulence caused by the vortex completely calmed down. The countless bubbles and countless regions of vacuum seemed as if they had never appeared in the first place. When everything had calmed down, the void where Luo Fan originally stood was slightly distorted. Immediately after, Luo Fan's born Taoism aptitude in this world, that octopus-like body, had already been restored. It looked no different from before, still at the level of a three tribulations expert, and still as leisurely as before. However, when the world's will had attacked him previously, he did not resist at all. Instead, he obeyed the will of the world's will and directly gave his body to the world's will, allowing the world's will to completely erase his body and even his existence in this world. This was because the world's will had already completed its goal and completely erased his existence. Therefore, the world's will in this world would naturally disappear again and return to its residence. Although Luo Fan's body and all other existences in this world had been completely erased, he still had many other worlds. However, he still had many other worlds. Although the will of the world had completely erased all of his existences in the real world, it was impossible for it to penetrate into all other planes. It was impossible for it to completely erase his corresponding existences in all other planes. This was because different worlds had different characteristics. In the end, there would still be some worlds that could not do anything to Luo Fan's corresponding existences, and Luo Fan was relying on these surviving existences that corresponded to him. Through many levels of communication, he was able to completely restore his body, spirit, strength, might, and everything else in this plane of reality. The entire process was unimaginably smooth. Things had developed as he had expected. The world's will had already disappeared after attacking once. Even if he appeared again now, the world's will would no longer care about him. Looks like the problem is not small. Seeing this, Luo Fan could not help but sigh again. Although he had already guessed that the world's will would not attack him after he recovered, he was still prepared for the possibility that the world's will would destroy him a few times. However, he had never expected that everything would proceed as he had guessed. This allowed him to understand that the will of the heaven and earth was missing much more than he had imagined. After all, if it were not for the fact that it was missing so much, the world's will would not have surrendered so easily. Looks like the world's will might have reincarnated into more than one living being, and the number might be unimaginable. However, is it because it wants to reincarnate or because something happened? This thought flashed across Luo Fan's mind. This world had not experienced any great world calamity. According to Luo Fan's calculations, it would take at least 10 billion years for the great world calamity to be born. This situation was almost the complete opposite of the 3 eyes and 4 elbows world situation. In the 3 eyes and 4 elbows world, the world encountered a great world calamity not long after it was born. After the great tribulation of heaven and earth, more and more tribulations appeared one after another. After that, countless tribulations combined to form the second great world calamity. Compared to the situation in this world, this kind of situation was simply 2 extremes. If any living being from the previous world came here, they would definitely be moved to tears. Perhaps the reason the great world calamity hasn't appeared yet is related to the lack of the world's will. With this thought, Luo Fan immediately left the peak at the bottom of the sea and came to the place where the vortex formed by the world's will was in the air. After arriving here, he looked over, and the vast world was directly imprinted in his eyes. The ground was undulating, and strange rivers appeared in the air one after another. These rivers were different from the rivers in other worlds. In other worlds, the rivers were filled with water of all kinds and attributes. However, at this moment, the many rivers in this world were filled with gaseous substances. There were all kinds of gases of all kinds and attributes. These gases converged to form rivers that flowed continuously in the sea, and he could even see all kinds of bird-like creatures soaring in the rivers. It was as if these bird-like creatures were the fishes of this world. Apart from this strange river, all sorts of coral-like existences could be found all over the world. In particular, in the area where he was previously, the colorful corals were even denser, more beautiful, and larger than the other areas. In the boundless sea, there was an endless amount of world's origin energy. This world's origin energy fused with the seawater, or rather, it was an important part of the seawater. In the seawater, it flowed along with the waves and continuously fused with the bodies of the countless creatures in the sea. At this moment, the cultivators in this world were everywhere in this world. They either flew in the sky or burrowed into the ground, soared in the sea, or directly drilled into the ground, making this world seem extraordinarily lively. Right below him, right at the edge of where he was before, there were a huge number of living beings here. These creatures gathered around him and formed city-like existences that surrounded the mountain in the center in a three-dimensional manner. In other words, they surrounded Luo Fan himself. Almost all the people living in those cities were cultivators, and they were not ordinary cultivators, but extremely powerful cultivators. At the very least, they were cultivators who occupied the highest position in this world. In these cities, the weakest cultivator was at the Khanate Zenith Heaven realm. The strongest had even reached the pseudo-saint realm. If it was in the previous world, cultivators of this level were naturally nothing, and they were not of much use in the huge tower. If one wanted to complete a mission, one would need to borrow the power of other powerhouses through various means. However, in this world where even the first great calamity of the world would only descend after tens of billions of years, the standard of such cultivators was not low, and they could definitely be considered experts. Obviously, these cultivators were the source of Luo Fan's confidence in ruling over this world. Outside of these cities, there were radiation circles one after another. In those circles of radiation there were a large number of cities, or rather, countries. These cities and countries were in an orderly manner. Each city and country had a passage that connected to the central city, and even the mountain in the center, and connected to Luo Fan who was on the mountain. The various passageways formed an extremely tight and perfect network, completely wrapping around an extremely large area of the world. The connection between them was unimaginably tight. From this structure, it could be seen how much success this fragment of Luo Fan had in managing this world over the years. If the will of the world has reincarnated, there must be something special about it. Perhaps it's time to use providence again. This thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. The light in his eyes began to change slightly, and the perspective in his eyes began to change into a perspective that he was extremely familiar with. The perspective of providence. As the perspective changed, the world that he saw instantly changed. The boundless seawater disappeared, the endless cities, and the infinite creatures also disappeared. What he saw was only waves of providence, seas of providence, and all sorts of strange images condensed from the various providence. Such a flourishing providence, it was indeed quite extraordinary. Chapter 24-26. The karmic luck here was so abundant that it was thousands of times more abundant than the previous world. At a glance, there were practically no gaps in the entire world, and it was filled with strands of karmic luck. Compared to the sparse and numerous strands of karmic luck in the previous world, the difference was unimaginably huge. Luo Fan had come into contact with the Tao of karmic luck in the past, and he had extremely deep attainments in this aspect. Coupled with the fact that he'd even played the role of the will of the world in his previous life, and he'd used karmic luck as a starting point to devour the grand Tao and the world, his research towards karmic luck was more than 1,000,000 times stronger than before. Under such circumstances, at this moment, the boundless ocean of karmic luck entered his eyes, and he saw something that was countless times more complicated than what he'd seen on the surface. Compared to the legends that could tell the rise and fall of dynasties and the rise and fall of emperors and generals with just a glance at karmic luck, the secrets Luo Fan saw through were countless times more abundant. It could be said that he'd seen through most of the secrets of this world with just a glance. There'll be a chance 3,000 years from now. At that time, I should be able to capture the existence that reincarnated from the will of the world. After deducing slightly in his heart, he'd already come to a conclusion. At this moment, even though he'd seen through the various secrets of the karmic luck in this world, he was still unable to find the portion of the will of the world that had reincarnated into this world. Truly, even though he knew the characteristics of the will of the world, he didn't know exactly why the will of the world had reincarnated into a living being. Since he didn't know exactly what the will of the world had done, he naturally didn't know exactly what its karmic luck looked like, so he was naturally unable to find its existence with a single glance. This was the profundity of the Tao of karmic luck. Even though he didn't know what the karmic luck of the will of the world was like after it reincarnated, there were all sorts of indescribable connections between karmic luck. These various connections caused the various karmic luck to affect each other, and if there was any special karmic luck, then it would definitely stand out at a certain moment. According to Luo Fan's deductions, that portion of the will of the world would be unable to be concealed after 3,000 years, and he would be able to see through it with a single glance. At that time, not only would he be able to find the existence of the reincarnation of the will of the heavens and the earth, he would even be able to instantly understand the objective of the reincarnation of the will of the heavens and the specific plans it had. With all these thoughts in mind, it was obvious what he should do. His figure moved slightly, and his octopus-like body curled up slightly. He was already curled up in the void, as if he had turned into a sphere. Then, the power in his body surged, and his body gradually became invisible. Other than those with higher cultivation than him, no one else could discover his existence. Clearly, his strength as a third tribulation cultivator had far surpassed the cultivation world of this world. So, unless he was willing, otherwise, no existence in this world would be able to discover his presence here. From the looks of it, Luo Fan intended to directly wait here for 3,000 years. For any cultivator who had transcended the limits of their lifespans, 3,000 years was not too long of a period of time. Although Luo Fan was already in existence with the highest status in this world, a supreme being who could change the situation of the entire world with a single word, he did not rule like an ordinary person in a high position. Instead, he ruled this world in a way that was like a hands-off shopkeeper. With such a way of ruling, even if he disappeared for millions or tens of millions of years, it would not arouse the suspicion of his subordinates, let alone a few thousand years. As for Luo Fan himself, these 3,000 years were nothing to him. To him, 3,000 years was not much different from an instant, so he naturally had even more patience to wait here for 3,000 years. Time continued to flow. 3,000 years passed in the blink of an eye. Just as Luo Fan had guessed, during these 3,000 years, this world operated according to the rules he had set. There were no abnormalities, and it seemed peaceful. Even from the perspective of providence, the endless providence of this world seemed to be no different from before at first glance. It was almost as if the scene from 3,000 years ago had been moved to 3,000 years later. Found it. On this day, Luo Fan, who was hiding in the void and looking at the entire world from the perspective of providence, suddenly had a thought. His eyes narrowed, and he suddenly focused his gaze on a certain place in this world. A wave of providence was directly imprinted in his eyes. This wave of providence was extremely strange. At first glance, it seemed to be only a little different from other providence. There seemed to be no difference in essence at all. However, as long as one looked closely, they would find that this wave of providence was fundamentally different from any other in this world. Moreover, it was not a small difference, but rather a rather shocking and huge difference, enough to completely distinguish this wave of providence from all other kinds of providence. This wave of providence was unimaginably stable. Over the past 3,000 years, the position of this wave of providence had changed. Sometimes it even merged with a certain ocean of providence, converged with the providence of a certain race, and overlapped with a certain other providence. However, after a period of time, when this wave of providence became independent again, they would find that this wave of providence was no different from before. If this was only once or twice, it would naturally not be a big deal. After all, the karmic luck that didn't change occasionally still existed in this world. However, from 3,000 years ago until now, this wave of providence had recovered nearly 1,000 times. There would not be any changes even if it interacted with other providence 1,000 times. This situation was impossible even for a false saint. In this world where no false saints had appeared before, It was difficult for Luo Fan not to connect such a wave of providence with the reincarnation of the will of heaven and earth that he was looking for. With a slight movement of his heart, Luo Fan stretched his body and once again transformed into the octopus-like appearance. Following that, his body trembled slightly. With a distortion in the void, he had already traversed a distance of hundreds of millions of light-years. He arrived directly at the place where the wave of providence was rising and saw the main body that was emitting it. It was a living being that looked like an octopus. In other words, it was a living being that used the connate Tao body of this world as its own appearance. From Luo Fan's point of view, this living being was naturally rather ugly. However, from the point of view of the connate Tao body of this world, this living being's appearance was absolutely perfect. The structure of its body, its lines, its rolling posture, and even the ups and downs of the patterns on its face were all in line with the requirements of the connate Tao body of this world. It could be said that if the appearance of this living being was directly engraved, it might be enough to become the visualization template for body tempering cultivation in this world. It would become the standard reference for body transformation. Such a creature should have been able to cultivate at an extremely fast pace. It was a little exaggerated to say that it could become an immortal in a day, but it was definitely not difficult to cultivate to the level of an itinerant immortal in 10 days to half a month. However, the cultivation of this living being in front of him was completely beyond Luo Fan's imagination. It was not unimaginably high, but unimaginably low. At this moment, although this living being had some cultivation, it was only equivalent to the level of the peak of the mortal realm. There was still a huge gap between it and the immortal realm. This situation was obviously at a level that was obviously impossible under normal circumstances. After all, based on what Luo Fan saw, this living being should have existed for as long as 3,000 years. Based on the body structure of this living being that was extremely compatible with the connate Tao body of this world, this living being should have long become a connate Grand Luo after such a long time. Moreover, this was only in the 3,000 years that Luo Fan had been paying attention to. Before Luo Fan paid attention to it, this living being had probably existed for more than 300 million years. Its cultivation realm should have long surpassed the connate Grand Luo. Even false saints should not be an obstacle for it. However, now, this living being's cultivation realm was only maintained at the peak of the mortal realm. It could not even transcend life and death, and even its lifespan was limited. How could this not surprise Luo Fan? "What do you want?" Luo Fan appeared and directly asked the living being in front of him. This living being was slightly shocked by Luo Fan's appearance. Then, when he saw Luo Fan clearly, he could not help but turn pale with fright. He hurriedly bowed and said, "Disciple Yun Zun greets the Holy Venerable." The Holy Venerable was Luo Fan's title in this world. This living being's behavior clearly meant that he had already recognized Luo Fan's identity in this world. Hearing this, Luo Fan frowned. He did not expect the reincarnation of the world's will in front of him to be completely unaware of his identity. With a thought, he raised a tentacle and curled it slightly. The living being instantly flew towards him, and its head fell directly under his tentacle. The tentacle pressed it down. After that, all sorts of profound energy flowed through the tentacles and into the creature's head. In the blink of an eye, it had seeped into the creature's head and started to search the creature's body, consciousness, and memories. As this investigation went on, all the living being's memories were directly unfolded in his mind. This living being had already noticed his uniqueness, but he only knew that it was special. He did not know what exactly his identity was, or why he was so special. All along, he had been like a lone star. No matter who he was with, that person would be unlucky. No matter what race or organization he joined, that race or organization would suffer losses very quickly. If he was unlucky, he might even be destroyed directly. Who knew how many years of hard work would be destroyed in a day? Because of this, He had initially strongly rejected joining any organization and being on good terms with any other living beings. However, what made him uncomfortable was that no matter how he deliberately avoided it, the final development of the situation would push him to be on good terms with others, or join a certain organization or a certain race without him realizing it. Sometimes, he suspected that there was a hidden hand controlling everything from behind the scenes and manipulating all his encounters. He had also tried his best to search for and resist it. However, from the very beginning until now, who knew how many tens of thousands of years had passed, he had gained nothing. Everything was so natural, and everything seemed to be just a coincidence. He seemed to have unknowingly wandered between various races and organizations through all sorts of coincidences, and he had also seen one living being after another that was on good terms with him suffer misfortune or even die a violent death. He was completely helpless against all of this, and he could not change anything at all. During these tens of thousands of years, he had hardened his heart to commit suicide countless times. However, no matter what method he used, even if he destroyed himself into pieces and turned himself into ashes, he would come back to life unknowingly and return to his original appearance. It would seem as if nothing had happened, and all the torture seemed as if it did not exist at all. After experiencing this living being finally gave up and could only live as he should. He befriended other living beings over and over again, then watched as those living beings suffered misfortune, and joined a race or an organization over and over again, then watched as those races or organizations were damaged or even destroyed. He really is the reincarnation of the world's will. Looking at all these memories, Luo Fan finally completely confirmed that this living being before him was Xing Lin, whom he had spent 3,000 years searching for. He could not help but reveal a strange smile on his face. Although he sympathized with what had happened to him, he was very clear that this was the characteristic of the reincarnation of the world's will. As the world's will, although he was only a part of it, he was still the world's will. Since he was the world's will, his reincarnation in this world was equivalent to a person cutting open a part of their soul and placing it into their body, circulating it along with the body's various mechanisms. Just like that, his existence would naturally cause many parts of his body to change, and naturally, those parts would become intimate with him and cooperate with him. The entire process was basically driven by his body's instincts. As a result, there were naturally no traces to be found, and it was difficult to find any abnormalities that should have existed. As for being unkillable and being able to revive even if one's body was crushed, the reason was even simpler. As a part of the world's will, it was naturally extremely mysterious. It could be destroyed and reborn in one's body, and as long as there was nothing wrong with one's body, it was naturally impossible for it to be destroyed. Using a part of one's will to adjust the world and delay the arrival of the great calamity of the world. Is this the choice of the perfect world? After understanding that this was a part of the true world's will, Luo Fan already knew the intentions of the world's will. He could not help but sigh in admiration. Chapter 24-27. Recover your memories. Luo Fan said calmly as he looked at the extremely perfect born Taoism aptitude that completely belonged to the world before him. As he spoke, the tentacle that covered the creature's head trembled slightly. All sorts of mysterious power poured into the creature's body, directly fusing with the god's consciousness, and began to dig into the endless memories hidden in the depths of the creature's consciousness. As the powers continued to dig, the creature felt waves of information gushing out from the depths of its soul. It completely drowned its consciousness in the blink of an eye, causing its gaze to become blank and its body to become powerless, as if all its power had been sucked away. After a while, Luo Fan let go of the creature and retracted all of his powers. He took a step back and quietly watched what the perfect-born Taoism aptitude would do next. The creature hovered there quietly, and its gaze gradually recovered from its blankness. Light began to gather in its eyes. You're no longer who you used to be. The creature's first sentence after its gaze gathered was beyond Luo Fan's expectations. It looked at Luo Fan like a supreme god looking down at a wriggling worm in the mud. It has the consciousness of the world's will and the thoughts of a living being's will. What a wonderful combination. It's a pity that it's still a combination that's neither great nor great. Luo Fan sighed when he saw this, and an inexplicable sense of disappointment appeared on his face. As his powers dug into the creature before him, most of the memories hidden deep within the creature's memories had been recovered. These memories had clearly allowed the creature to recognize its own nature and know that it was part of the world's will. It had even allowed the creature to see more things, and it had probably even seen through some of Luo Fan's nature. "You're the enemy of the world," the creature said to Luo Fan. As it spoke, a series of muffled rumbles were heard in the sky. Amidst these muffled sounds, Luo Fan faintly felt as if the entire world was repelling and suppressing him. If he didn't have the consciousness of the whole body, he would definitely not be able to withstand this pressure and rejection. His body might even collapse and be destroyed in the process. However, it was clear that such an if did not happen. Right now, not only did his consciousness enter the fragment, but his cultivation level had also increased beyond imagination due to the descent of his consciousness. He had reached the level of a 3 calamities cultivator. Under such circumstances, although the rejection and oppression were a little uncomfortable for him, it was only a little uncomfortable. In fact, it wasn't even enough to injure him. "Sure enough, I can't hide it from you." Luo Fan just smiled. At that moment the creature frowned. Clearly, it felt that something was wrong with the situation. After all, he had already recovered the majority of his memories as the will of the world. He clearly knew just how much stronger he was compared to before, and he also understood just how powerless all the living beings in the world were before him. However, under such circumstances, the enemy of the world could actually look at him with such a gaze and treat him with such an attitude. How could he not be shocked? However, although he had recovered the memories brought by the will of the world, they were ultimately just memories. As memories, although they could let him know many things and even allow him to easily use a lot of power, they were ultimately just memories. In the end, one's power still needed to be accumulated over time to catch up. Hence, the current him was not much of a threat to the current Luo Fan. At this moment, after Luo Fan finished his sentence, his figure flickered, and his many tentacles spread out, fiercely covering the creature. The creature's eyes flashed and it said, "Impudent." As it spoke, the void distorted and endless laws condensed, turning into countless chains that appeared out of nowhere around Luo Fan. They fiercely stabbed towards Luo Fan's body in an attempt to pin him to the chains. At the same time, the void trembled. Endless power and power were born out of nowhere, directly enveloping the void within a range of tens of thousands of miles. In the blink of an eye, the area seemed to have fallen into the end of the world. Faced with this situation, Luo Fan smiled faintly. The void behind him shook and a ball of light that seemed to be alive appeared out of nowhere. As this ball of light appeared, everything seemed to have been paused and came to a complete standstill. This included the chains formed by the laws, the power, and everything else that had appeared out of nowhere. The creature that was born from the will of the world instantly showed fear in its eyes. The way it looked at Luo Fan, as if he was a bug in the dust, had completely collapsed. At this moment, it clearly knew what kind of existence it was facing. Just what kind of unimaginable power did the person before it possess? However, it was clearly too late for it to think about this now. At this moment, Luo Fan's many tentacles had already wrapped around it. With a slight tremble, its body suddenly collapsed and turned into endless powder that splattered everywhere. Only an indescribable ball of light was left where the creature had originally been. At this moment the entire world shook violently. In the void above Luo Fan's head, a huge vortex started to appear out of nowhere. An incomparably majestic, terrifying, and pressurizing aura was released from the vortex. It pressed downwards, causing the entire world to sink into a desolate state. At this moment, Luo Fan calmly raised his head and glanced at the vortex above. As he glanced over, he threw the ball of the world's will that was wrapped around by the tentacles backward and directly threw it into the light that seemed to be alive. In other words, it was thrown into the light of heaven and earth. The moment the ball of world's will was thrown into the light of heaven and earth, the vortex in the sky began to shake even more violently. As it shook, there seemed to be an intense emotion similar to anger coming from the vortex, causing the entire world to seem to be enraged. At this moment, the fragment of light of heaven and earth behind Luo Fan began to evolve rapidly. In the blink of an eye, it turned into a vortex and began to shred and devour the bit of world's will. Endless lightning appeared out of thin air and pounced towards Luo Fan from all directions. It directly filled every inch of the void around him. No matter where he looked, he could only see the extremely terrifying lightning. He couldn't even see through the lightning to see what was happening outside. The lightning was endless, covering the sky and earth as it pressed down on Luo Fan. Wherever the lightning passed, spacetime would distort and laws would collapse. Even the Tao behind him would naturally make way for it. If it was used to attack other cultivators, even a false sage would have to peel off a layer of skin in the face of such an attack before being able to escape. However, at this moment, Luo Fan did not show any abnormal reaction in the face of such an endless amount of lightning. In fact, he did not even glance at those lightning bolts. Just by relying on the various undulations created by the stirring of the light of the world, he easily dispersed those lightning bolts, causing them to be unable to release much power the instant they struck his body. They could not even harm his clothes, let alone his body. After an unknown period of time, it seemed like only a few breaths, but it also seemed like a few days. All of a sudden, a tremendous impact erupted from where Luo Fan was and swept in all directions. The endless lightning that appeared out of nowhere in the surroundings, which could distort spacetime, distort laws, and repel the Tao, was completely shattered in an instant. In the blink of an eye, it was completely cleared. At this moment, the place where Luo Fan was had become clear. At this moment, Luo Fan's body had undergone an earth-shattering change. His body that was originally in the form of an octopus had turned into a form that he was more familiar with. Or rather, it could be said that it was already in the form of a natural Taoism aptitude that completely belonged to him. In other words, it was in the form of a human. Meanwhile, the light of heaven and earth behind his head had completely turned into the form of a vortex. Its form was also quite different from when it had minced and devoured the bit of will of heaven and earth. Although it was also a vortex, the vortex from before was extremely violent. It seemed to be constantly releasing terrifying power that was enough to obliterate and destroy everything. But now, the vortex was completely different. This vortex was more stable and more mysterious. It did not look like a ball of light, but more like an eye. It was an extremely mysterious eye that seemed to have grown directly from the depths of spacetime and above the Tao. The vortex that looked like an eye was quite similar to the vortex that had formed in the void above. The only difference was that the vortex above was larger and more illusory. At this moment, mysterious waves of fluctuations spread out from the vortex behind Luo Fan. These fluctuations seeped into the surrounding spacetime, the surrounding laws, and even the Tao in the dark. These fluctuations did not let go of the slightest bit and seeped into it bit by bit. The area that the fluctuations had seeped into was independent, and it formed a clear separation from the wider world outside. In this separation, nothing in the outside world could affect everything in this area. It was precisely because of this that Luo Fan was able to transform himself into this form at this moment and restore the body structure that he was most familiar with. If not for these fluctuations isolating the inside from the outside, he would either be unable to control such great power because this form was not recognized by the world, and would directly collapse and be destroyed. Otherwise, he would be rejected by the world's will and the Tao because he did not have the appearance of a born Taoism body that controlled such great power. In the end, endless tribulations would descend to wipe him out. The reason for this was actually quite simple. After all, the light of heaven and earth that his fragment carried had already devoured a bit of the world's will. This was equivalent to the light of heaven and earth, from a certain point of view, becoming a part of the world's will. Since it was the world's will, even if it was only a part, it was enough to isolate the pressure of the entire world's will. It was enough to allow the entire world's will to ignore some abnormalities that appeared in the area enveloped by this small part of the world's will. At this moment, the huge eye-like vortex in the sky twisted slightly, and there seemed to be a vague feeling of loss coming from it. Evidently, because it was not complete, the world's will was unable to clearly determine the essence of the light of heaven and earth after it encountered the light of heaven and earth that had devoured a small part of it. It did not know whether it should deal with this bit of light of heaven and earth, and whether it should deal with Luofan, who was enveloped by the light of heaven and earth. "Looks like I've succeeded." Sensing this, Luofan smiled faintly. He had originally thought that the light of heaven and earth could devour a part of the world's will that had reincarnated, and that it could become a focal point for his plan. However, he did not think that this focal point would be so useful. It could actually completely blind the senses of the world's will, as well as the world's will's hostility towards him. Compared to what he had expected, this was many times better. With a thought, he took a step forward and charged upwards in a flash. In the blink of an eye, he arrived before the huge vortex. At this moment, almost all living beings in the world could not help but look at the vortex from all directions. When they saw Luofan, the countless living beings were dumbfounded. "What kind of creature is this? Why is it so ugly?" The shock and bewilderment appeared in the hearts of most living beings at this moment, causing them to be dumbfounded and lament. To the living beings who regarded the octopus as the standard of beauty, Luofan, who did not even have tentacles and had such strange facial features, was clearly not good-looking. To them, the current Luofan was nothing more than a monster. The vortex began to stir violently at this moment. A great repulsive force appeared above the vortex, and it rushed towards Luofan fiercely. If it was not for the light of heaven and earth, which was like the world's will, protecting Luofan, what rushed over might not have been a repulsive force, but an endless attack. Evidently, the world's will felt that something was wrong and was unwilling to let Luofan approach it. Chapter 24-28. The moment the passageway was formed, the entire world seemed to have been struck by a terrifying force, causing an extremely strange tremor. Waves of boundless energy gathered towards the passageway from all directions, trying to drown the passageway and mend it once again. Unfortunately, although the boundless power shook the passageway and caused it to sway continuously, as if it was about to completely collapse in the next moment, the passageway eventually stabilized. In the end, it still carried Luofan and stepped into the residence of the world's will. With the small vortex behind him protecting him, Luofan seemed to be in a precarious situation, but he was actually extremely stable. In just a few short breaths, he passed through the passageway and arrived at the mysterious place. A place that was almost filled with a huge vortex. When he arrived here, the passageway behind him naturally no longer needed to be maintained. He immediately released the power that was maintaining the passageway, causing it to completely collapse in the blink of an eye and disappear without a trace. Although the world's will was already broken, it was still the world's will. As the world's will, its level of thinking was naturally not something that ordinary living beings could understand. Therefore, even if Luofan wanted to communicate with the world's will, he could not find a way at all. Under such circumstances, there was naturally no way for them to talk. Luofan looked at the huge vortex in front of him. With a slight thought, the light of heaven and earth behind his head charged forward and crashed into the vortex. It began to spin and stir wildly as it tore at the vortex with all its might. The huge vortex reacted extremely violently to the invasion of the light of heaven and earth. The center of the vortex seemed to have shifted to its original edge, which was where the light of the heavens and earth had invaded at this moment. The vortex frantically strangled the light of the heavens and earth, wanting to destroy the light of the heavens and earth and retrieve the will of the heavens and earth contained within it. Regardless of what the world's will had planned for this world, it was no longer important at this juncture of life and death. Now, the most important thing for the world's will was to retrieve the portion of the world's will that it had split off and gather all its power to wipe out the living beings that dared to offend it. Apart from that, everything else was secondary in the face of such a situation. Luo Fan didn't care at all. He directly sat cross-legged outside the vortex. His eyes seemed to be open and closed, and his mind seemed to have entered a state that couldn't be described with words. It was as if he had transformed into an incomparably huge and terrifying thing, and was clashing and fighting with an even bigger and more terrifying existence. In a trance, there seemed to be endless information and principles constantly surging into his mind, infiltrating his memories, affecting his will, and distorting his thoughts. Fortunately, his view of the world was extremely firm, and it was like a final barrier that isolated all influences that could cause irreversible changes to his mind. That was why he was able to maintain his sense of self during this process and not be overturned by the various changes that occurred. As the conflict occurred in the residence of the will of the heavens and earth, there was also a drastic change outside the residence. A faintly discernible vortex appeared in the sky. This vortex was like a huge eye, staring at everything under the sky. No matter what kind of living being it was, whether they were strong or weak, they all felt as if they were being stared at by this eye at this moment. A kind of fear and awe involuntarily arose in them. As time passed, the vortex gradually began to change. It was as if a huge and unparalleled force was pulling at this vortex, causing the center of the vortex to produce a strange deviation, gradually turning from the center to the edge. The color of the vortex also gradually began to change subtly from the center after the deviation. It was a change that could clearly be seen, but it was impossible to describe exactly what the difference was. After all, whether it was the vortex's original color or the color after the change, it was completely indescribable with words. This change gave all living beings an indescribable ominous premonition. It was as if this was a great disaster for them. For a moment it was unknown how many living beings directly knelt and prayed. Moreover, unlike in the past, the more brilliant and knowledgeable living beings were now, the more pious they were. Instead, those who were less knowledgeable were a little perfunctory. The reason for this was naturally because the more brilliant and knowledgeable living beings were, the more they understood the danger of this change, and the more they understood how dangerous it was for the entire world and all living beings if this change could not be stopped. As this change occurred, the karmic luck of all living beings began to undergo all sorts of subtle changes. If Luo Fan was observing the entire world from the perspective of karmic luck, he would discover that endless karmic luck was beginning to gather towards the residence of the will of the heavens and earth. It was as if the residence of the will of the heavens and earth had an unimaginable attraction to karmic luck. This world paid attention to karmic luck to begin with. It could even be said that karmic luck was more important to this world than to other worlds. Under such circumstances, the originally ethereal karmic luck in this world was naturally much more useful than other worlds. As a result, the karmic luck gathered was like a shot of adrenaline for the will of the heavens and earth. As it trembled, it began to spin faster and faster, and its strangling power towards the light of the heavens and earth continuously increased. As this change occurred, a pained expression appeared on Luo Fan's face. Strands of light began to seep out of his body, forming a net of light around him. doing its best to block some invisible pressure from the outside. These lights were extremely mysterious, and each one was a concept ability. Different lights represented different concepts and divine abilities. Now that the countless lights had formed a net, it was equivalent to countless concept abilities combining into a whole. This whole was extremely mysterious, and vaguely had the taste of a worldview. It seemed to have an astonishing blocking effect on everything in the outside world, be it tangible or intangible. After the silk net was formed, even if the silk net didn't seem to be under any pressure, or even deformed, Luo Fan's complexion still became a lot better, as if some kind of pressure that targeted him had been intercepted by him. At this moment, the light of the heavens and earth trembled slightly, and an extremely astonishing light was suddenly released. These rays of light were in the form of threads, constantly spreading in all directions. During this process, countless threads of light intertwined with each other, gradually forming a larger and larger net, occupying a wider and wider area in this huge vortex. Success! At this moment, the light in Luo Fan's eyes narrowed slightly, and the state of opening and closing completely disappeared. An inexplicable smile appeared on his face. Just now, his mind had already fused with the light of the heavens and earth that completely belonged to him, and the purpose was to guide the light of the heavens and earth to devour the will of the heavens and earth. It wasn't difficult for the light of the heavens and earth to devour the will of the heavens and earth. However, that wasn't because the light of the heavens and earth could devour the will of the heavens and earth at will. It was just because the amount of the will of the heavens and earth was too little. Because it was too little, the will of the heavens and earth was extremely weak compared to the light of the heavens and earth, and its resistance against the light of the heavens and earth was also extremely weak. That was why the entire devouring process was so smooth. It was obviously wrong to estimate the difficulty of the light of the heavens and earth devouring the will of the heavens and earth based on this difficulty. After all, although the will of the heavens and earth was incomplete due to the lack of the will of the heavens and earth, it had lost the various powers and incredible abilities that a complete will of the heavens and earth should have. But in terms of quantity, it was still countless times more than the will of the heavens and earth. Under such circumstances, Luo Fan closed his eyes and fused his mind with the light of the heavens and earth after he sent the light of the heavens and earth into the will of the heavens and earth. He guided the light of the heavens and earth and integrated various devouring techniques into it so that the light of the heavens and earth could devour the will of the heavens and earth in a more skillful manner. The facts proved that his considerations were correct. Although the light of the heavens and earth was of a much higher level than Luo Fan's, it was still at the level of the will of the heavens and earth. However, it had only taken form not long ago, and there was still a huge gap between it and the true will of the heavens and earth. In terms of the will of the heavens and earth's ability to think, it was far inferior to Luo Fan's. In this way, without Luo Fan's guidance, the light of the heavens and earth could only rely on its own instincts to resist the will of the heavens and earth. In a situation where the enemy was strong and they were weak, such a choice could only be considered as courting death. However, with Luo Fan's participation and guidance, the situation was clearly completely different. Under his guidance, he directly used the light of the heavens and earth's ability to devour the great Tao in the previous world. The light of the heavens and earth split into countless threads, forming a net that devoured the will of the heavens and earth. Fortunately, the light of the heavens and earth had already devoured a bit of the will of the heavens and earth before, so it could now confuse the will of the heavens and earth's senses towards him. This gave the light of the heavens and earth time to form a net. If it weren't for this convenience, the will of the heavens and earth would definitely treat these threads as foreign objects, and they would be completely destroyed by the will of the heavens and earth before they could form a net. As the net was formed, Luo Fan already clearly understood that the light of the heavens and earth's devouring of the will of the heavens and earth was already on the right track. The will of the heavens and earth no longer had any ability to resist. At this moment, he discovered that waves of providence were appearing out of nowhere from all directions, like rivers flowing into the sea. They were continuously pouring into the vortex in front of him. With a slight jolt in his heart, he already understood what was going on and could not help but sigh softly. It's a pity that we can't coexist. The heavens and earth were specially constructed by the Great Tribulation to restrict him and assimilate him. If he wanted to survive this Great Tribulation, he would have to transcend this world, and to do so, he would obviously have to fight against the will of the heavens and earth. In this way, although he did not have any enmity towards the living beings in this world, he had no choice but to go against their will. He even had no choice but to kill them with a wave of his hand. An even larger vortex appeared out of thin air around the huge vortex. It was like a cover that completely enveloped the huge vortex, which was also the will of the heavens and earth. After the huge vortex appeared, it directly received the providence that was continuously pouring into the will of the heavens and earth, directly cutting off the providence that the will of the heavens and earth had obtained. This caused the will of the heavens and earth to lose its source of replenishment, and it could only rely on its own accumulation to resist the corrosion and devouring of the light of the heavens and earth. Following this change, all the living beings in the void in the outside world looked up and saw a figure suddenly appear around the vortex. It was the figure of the monster that everyone had seen before, the figure that had soared into the sky. However, compared to before, this figure seemed so sacred and majestic at this time. Although it still did not conform to their aesthetic standards, they actually felt an indescribable harmony and perfection from it. In fact, some living beings even faintly felt that the appearance of this creature was more harmonious and perfect than their own appearance. What is this? This doubt appeared in the hearts of almost all the living beings at this moment, making them all feel bewildered. When the figure of the monster appeared, the vortex that they felt would have a huge impact on the changes gradually began to glow. This light was not very strong at first, and it could only be considered as a faint radiance. However, as time passed, as the figure became more and more real, the light became stronger and stronger. In the end, it looked like a sun that was countless times larger than a normal sun had appeared in the sky. An extremely sacred, majestic, and powerful aura spread out from the glowing vortex at this moment. Being enveloped by this extremely dazzling light that should have been enough to blind them, all the living beings felt an indescribable warmth surge into their hearts. It was as if they had returned to their mother's embrace at this moment, and they felt that incomparably vast warmth. This should have been an extremely comfortable and satisfying feeling. However, at this moment, all the living beings with sharp senses felt an indescribable sense of unease.